It's June 27th, 2023. We're at Studio 2 at Sunset Sound Recorders in Hollywood, California, and we're joined by a very, very special guest, a hero of mine, not only in engineering, but business.
Oh.
These guys are here for the engineering. I want to learn about business and how to win. I want to win. Alan Sides is not only a legendary recording studio owner and an engineer, he's been wildly successful in business and innovative in creating and designing studios and buying up to 50 studios at one point.
I bought quite a few studios over the years, yeah. It was a good run. But that was kind of Bill Putnam, though. You know, Bill and I decided that I said to Bill, hey, Bill, I got an idea here. He says, I think there's some opportunity here. I'll find the deal, you fund it, and we package deal it. So we bought out RCA Studios in Hollywood, Wally Heider, record plant in New York. It just went on and on and on. But for me, it was an opportunity to gather a rather amazing collection of gear.
Yep.
I think at one point I had 17 Fairchild 670s.
Wow. Now they're at a price tag of $500,000.
Hard to even imagine. Yeah. Well, like 610 consoles. I mean, I can't even believe what those are worth. Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Crazy, so.
Briefly before we start, in one sentence, what's the key to success for Alan Sides? What have you found?
Well, the thing for me, it was never about the money. It was all about the fun of being in the studio and making great sounds. Okay, and I think if you make great sounds and you do good stuff, success will come your way. So, and I just, I love great sounding rooms, I love great studios, and I love designing speaker systems. And for me, like in the garage, the speaker system we had in there was pretty shocking. And because of that, it opened all sorts of doors. I remember one time, a friend of mine was doing an album and he was working over at the Complex, which is just getting started. And so he says, well, yeah, your speakers sound great, but this guy, George Massenberg, has some pretty good speakers too. And I said, oh, really? So I went over and I met George, and then we kind of clicked, and George, I got a little tape I'll play for you. It was like Little Feat, right? And I go, wow, that was really impressive. So then George came over to the garage, and I said, well, listen to this. And then George and I became best friends, and then we were partners in business. We did so many things together.
The garage studio was before you had Montana,
yes,
Santa Monica?
It was before. Yes, that's correct, yeah.
Let's clarify that, because I don't understand that either. You had a garage that you kind of displayed your monitors.
But it was a studio.
It was a studio.
Well, I actually had a studio in 10th grade, which was under Pacific Ocean Park. That was called, Acoustic Control Studios. How about that, right? And it was actually a friend of mine. I worked at a hi-fi store called Dow Radio on West Boulevard. And the owner wanted to always have a beer bar, but Ocean Park had closed. And he rented a building on the corner, and he started this club on the top. But underneath in the basement was an old speakeasy nightclub. And so I set up a PA system for the club, and he gave me that space for my studio. So I had 4,000 square feet under the park. And I had these two, there was this 40 by 60 foot underground hallway where I put two voice theaters and a couple of AKG 60s as my reverb. And then I had these Niagara 3s I used for the pre-delay for that, but I had a studio there. That was my first studio, and I had that in 11th and 12th grade.
Wow. Where'd you go to high school? In Santa Monica?
I went to what's now Brentwood School.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
It was Brentwood Academy. It was a military school back then.
Yeah.
And so I grew up, there. And but that studio was, back then, I think I had two Ampex 354 2-tracks, right? So when I recorded a band, I would basically record the band live to 2-track, and then we would play that, and then I would do the vocals and the guitars and stuff to a second 2-track mixed live.
Wow.
And that's the way we did it. And so you're only one generation away, and then the vocals and guitars were all first generation. Then you just edit. You can do as many takes as you want and just edit them together.
Yeah.
And so I did 2 tracks, and that's how we recorded it back then.
Sound on sound.
Yeah,
Paul,
anyway,
we talk about stories on the show, but also personally all the time. For years now, Hank Santacola Sr. was a gentleman that worked with Frank Sinatra.
Well, he was his bodyguard.
And a piano player, and did gigs
kind of
with
a
him.
Manager, too. It was, they were there together. But,
Yeah.
Pretty close, I guess.
And he gets this publishing gifted to him, which I'm told was not that important or wasn't believed to be so lucrative at that time.
Well, that's according to my father. Because I said to my dad, how did Hank Sr. get the publishing? And he said, well, we didn't think in terms back in those days that publishing was a big deal. Not like it is now. That's what he told me. And he said that Frank was a generous guy, and when he had this falling out with Hank Sr., he gifted him the publishing at that point for everything he had done.
Wow.
But the other thing, because all of the semi-conscious Fancies and Tunes were in that catalog, but also, the Cal and Neva Lodge, he was a partner in that as well. And when they kind of split their assets,
right.
Frank got the Lodge, which then, of course, he lost the Gaming Commission because basically they took away his license because of mafia connections, supposedly.
Yeah.
So that was a buzz. But he got the publishing. And that turned into be a rather nice thing.
Wow.
And Sammy Kahn used to be in the office of Barton. I used to hang out with Sammy, and he was a very funny guy. He was very entertaining. But it worked out good for Hank.
But
Yeah,
then there's a Hank
real
Jr., his son, you worked with.
Hank was
a partner of yours.
Was a close friend. And then what happened is we were in the garage, and the garage was very successful. But I said, I really needed to expand. So we found this building in Montana, and Hank and I built a studio, which became Ground Control, which I sold to Paul Radishek later on. And that was a very nice studio. It had a nice API console. And I was just telling Paul that the API console that went in that room, that came from, it was at Warner Brothers in the mix room. And they bought the console new and decided it was way too record, wasn't film enough. So we bought the console, and we were going to put it in the room. And then we had almost finished construction, and the owner of the building sued us, claiming we had done some construction without his permission. So that delayed the whole project a year. So then that API console that I had, I ended up leasing it to 20th Street Fox because I was, when I was running the garage studios, I was also the technical director for the Fox scoring stage for about 5 or 6 years. And so I redesigned that room, put my speakers in, and I ended up leasing this console. But I think we bought the console for like $80,000 from Warner Brothers, and then we leased it to Fox for a year at $10,000 a month. So when we got it off a lease.
Good value for you.
But the story gets even crazier because anyway, so we installed the studio. It was a really nice studio. And I was working in there. I was working with George Benson. And Al Schmidt really liked it too, right? And Tommy LaPuma. So then that's when Bill Putnam called me and offered me the potential of taking over Studio B. And so I said to Hank, maybe, that's kind of the direction I should head. And so we ended up, we were going to sell it to Tommy LaPuma and Al Schmidt and George Benson. And we had reached a deal. And then they said, well, we're going to put a Neve in there so we don't need the API. So then we sold that API to my friend Rick at Supertramp. So that API went to Rick. And we sold to him for the same price we paid for it, a year and a half later. And it went to his studio in Encino. Right. And then it was a really nice studio, but then we ended up, I ended up with Studio B, and then we ended up selling that to Paul Radishek. Was another friend of
I
mine.
think that was the first time I heard your monitors was on Montana, going into Ground Control.
Oh, yeah.
And going like, wow, because I had worked at Capitol and Village and here and many studios at that time. But the speakers at that point in time were really, really impressive, as was Studio B at Ocean Way B was one of, it still is a great room, but that room with those speakers and that Dalcon console honestly may have been the best sounding room ever. Tiny control room, as you know, just fit a producer, engineer, and an artist.
Well,
and
sort of like this one right here.
But even smaller, perhaps.
Yeah.
And that combination was pretty extraordinary sounding.
Well, we had a lot of fun in that room. That was my, because when I moved to the garage, we took what was the blue room, you remember, which is that we set the control room up there first while we redid the A control room. Because I had projects I had to finish, but it was going to take me a while. And then we moved everything into that other room. And then, of course, the Dalcon console, the custom board that we had there, Bill Putnam had built all his consoles for his various rooms. And, but when Bill had some heart issues and other problems, he sort of wasn't as directly involved in the console design as he was originally. And, of course, my first console in the garage was the original tube board out of Studio One.
Wow.
That New York was done on, and all those, records. Oh. And that's the first board I installed. It's an 18 input tube console with glyph faders, had the 508 VEQs and all 1008 preamps. But I ended up selling that to Paul Radishek, and he put it in his studio in Long Beach. Now, if we could find that console, no one knows where it ended up. It disappeared completely.
Really?
No one's seen it.
And what about Paul?
Can't remember
Is he still with us?
Who?
Paul Radishek?
Oh, yeah. He's dubbing mixer.
Yeah, he's around for sure. Yeah.
He has no idea who he sold it to.
Wow.
He cannot remember where it went. I can't imagine what it'd be worth if you could find it now. It's quite an interesting board.
Wow.
But then we got a Bushnell console after that out of studio. I think it was the one out of studio. It might have come out of Studio A. And then I ended up selling that to Henry Santacola, and he put it in his mother's house, and we had a studio in his mother's living room.
Really? Oh,
Yeah.
I didn't even know about that.
Oh, yeah. No, he had the Bushnell sitting in his house there.
How'd you meet Hank Jr.
I
Santacola?
can't remember how I met him, but that's how I first came to your studio in Santa Monica. Was that called Ocean Way then?
Well, we would call it Ocean Way West.
Yeah.
Right.
Because that's what I recall. When I first went there with him, it was Ocean Way West.
That's amazing, Paul. That you actually got a chance to. You know, what's funny is that I don't have any pictures of that studio.
Wow.
Oh, bummer.
But I think, it's really, we just haven't, it's, what can I say? It's gone now. But
It was a really great, comfortable place. I did so many records there. Al Stewart and Tori Amos and a number of things. And in fact, Larry Klein was always there with Joni.
Oh, yeah.
So I got to hang out with Joni multiple times, which was amazing.
She is so much fun. It's almost scary.
Yeah.
Her stories, she gets on a roll, Joni Mitchell. I cannot. Probably my best doing the Both Sides Now record with her. It was maybe...
LA Philharmonic, too, right?
Yeah, with London Symphony, right. We did that, and then we just had... I can't say how much fun we had. One time, actually, my buddy Ry Cooder was there. And because Ry Cooder had, he lived in what was an old fire station just down the street from the Ocean Way Garage. And then we sort of clicked, so we did like a dozen movies together and stuff. But he's also a great storyteller, and Joni's a great storyteller. So it's the two of them together are really fun. We were mixing that album, I think, in 5/1. And we just hung out. We couldn't leave. We just stayed there talking. And
yeah, she loved to talk and smoke cigarettes constantly and curse a little bit.
Yes. Talk about David Geffen as the devil from Incarnate. Yeah. There are various things she would say.
Paul walked into the echo chamber at 12 years old, and she was sitting in there doing her first record in Studio One with David Crosby. Producing, and he was a young 12 year old.
I didn't know who she was. She wouldn't tell me who she was. Then finally, when I was leaving, I'm like, come on, what's your name? She was like, oh, it's Joni. And I realized, found out who it was. Yeah.
You have all the pictures from that session, too. They're incredible. He was
That's
dating
amazing.
her at the same time, and I think she was 17, maybe?
Wow.
Really? She was that young?
Maybe, yeah, she was in her teens.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Where did you first get the spark to do any of this? From your parents or through hearing records?
No, actually, my dad was great, but, he thought that, he said at one point, he said, son, I think it's time to get a real job.
Sounds great.
I heard that a lot.
You know what I'm saying? It's like, actually, I said Brian Setzer, when he married Christine, Christine's father was an amazing carpenter, right? And he felt that what Brian Setzer did wasn't really work. You know what I'm saying? And Brian did feel it was work, a lot of work, actually. So, but anyway, sorry, I lost my place. We were just saying...
what sparked all of this, the engineering, the design,
Well, I was a bass player and a guitar player, and I spent a lot of time because my dad was sort of a surfer. We were all surfers, actually, and so we would spend time in Hawaii in the summer, quite a bit of time. And so I had a little band, and we used to play at the, teen dances and stuff, and we used to play clubs and jazz things and stuff. But I was 13 and a half or 14 years old. And then I met all these Hawaiian musicians who were my dear friends, and so I would go out hanging with them till 2 a.m. at 14 years of age. And I just loved. I had my Hawaiian friends, I had my LA friends. And then I started designing club systems, that I did in Hawaii.
Wow.
And so, but I love to play, but mostly, I was a speaker guy. So the thing was, it's finding those great recordings to play, and there are very few. I wish to say there were more, but it's the handful, and that's where I became a big fan of Phil Ramone, and certainly Roy Halley, and certainly Bill Schnee even, and Al, of course. But Phil did stuff live to 2-track that just sounded insanely good.
Everything. I mean, Phil was really one of my mentors and was so kind to me. And the Paul Simon stuff, the Billy Joel stuff, going back to the Quincy albums.
Oh my God!
They're just stunning. The sound of those records.
Yeah, I mean, that one song that Quincy did was Phil Ramone did that song that's in Austin Powers. Da 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 with the flutes.
I didn't know that.
Oh my God, that sounds
Did
ridiculous.
you Spackwater Jack too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's
amazing.
what a great sounding record.
incredible. I don't know, Phil. And it was interesting just knowing Phil's history to see him not in the engineer's seat, but in the producer's seat, working with all these other great engineers, Al many times, and Ed Cherney, and Steve Boyer, and a bunch of different guys who are fantastic. But knowing Phil and how great he was, and the diplomat and the storyteller that he was on top of it all, just an extraordinary person.
Well, like I know when Phil was doing Yentl, right, with Barbra Streisand, right? He says, very funny, he says to me, we're doing these mixes, right, as the Warner Brothers stage. And no matter where the vocal was, Barbara would say, I can't even hear myself. And Phil goes, okay, yeah, more vocal, more vocal. And at one point he had a flag done that says, more me, and hung it up between the speakers. And Barbara comes in, you think that's funny? He says, yeah, I guess it is funny. And Ramon, he said, he didn't say specifically, but he says certain artists have the patience of a gnat. I'm not saying any description of any particular artist, but he was what a diplomat.
Yeah, he was wonderful. The way he handled artists all the time was just really, really a total learning experience to watch him. The things could be falling apart, the consoles could be broken and on fire or whatever. And Phil would be, we'll just take a little break. We'll get a little food and we'll fix it in 15 minutes. And we're going to get right to that vocal because that's so important and you're singing so well. And he had this way of just calming everybody down.
Because also, A&R Studios was pretty amazing in New York, right? But you never let it stop you. So this doesn't work. You just have to get through it. The show must go on, as my friend Burt Bacharach always said.
Yeah,
we need to get this done. There's no, So I think a lot of these engineers, like my studios, maybe they would something would go wrong and they'd stop the whole session. And I said, John, we come to a place where no. Let's keep the wheels turning.
Yeah.
And Phil knew that the most important thing was to keep the musicians happy and get it with the program. Because I used to work with like Rob Cavallo a lot on a lot of projects, and when Rob come, he had no patience for sounds. We didn't get sounds. We just recorded. We just walked in, and so it's all about prep time. Everything, I would sit the drums, balance everything out in the headphones. When they walked in, we recorded.
Can I do a segue for you here?
Oh, please.
Drew?
Of course.
Yeah.
I think we recorded a number of the same artists.
Yes.
Frank Zappa, for sure. But you did Alanis's Uninvited.
Right.
And I produced one of Alanis's albums here, Havoc and Bright Lights, about 10 years ago.
Right.
But working with Rob and Alanis and that track and David Campbell, who arranged and killed that arrangement. It's just like Led Zeppelin goes to the movies. It's an incredible track. She sung so well, as she always does, effortlessly. But I'd like to know, as a fan and somebody who's worked with her, that whole experience, because that track is really, really a classic.
Well, it's kind of interesting how that went down, because Alanis had a demo that she liked, which was piano and vocal. And Rob says, well, I think we can make a great track out of this. So we went in, and she didn't come, Tim Pierce, was there. Everybody was all good players. And so we had basically just done the first pass. And then Alanis comes in and says, God, that's great. Okay, let me do a pass with it. So she sang live. We did one more pass, and it was almost there. And she said, okay, let's just do one more pass. So we kept the first half of the vocal, and then we did one more pass and punched the second half of the vocal. So the entire vocal was done really across 2 takes. And that's
how she is. When I worked with her, the same way. It's 1-2 takes. There was one particular song I remember where she was having a hard time with some of the phrasing in the bridge, and we must have punched in the bridge 6 times, and she was like, oh, this is so unusual. I never do that. All my vocals are 1-2 takes. And if you think how many classics she's made, how many millions of albums she's done, she gets up to her C12, which she always sounded great on a C12 with me.
Oh, yeah.
And 1 take, it's done.
Well, we did actually, I think we did one more take, and then she did the harmony. So we had the first half was one, the second half was done, and then with the harmony. So really, I'd say it was probably the 4th pass was the finished track.
Yep, it's like working with Elton John.
Oh, yeah.
You're done a lead vocal, doubles and harmonies in 15, 20 minutes.
Incredible.
And they're killer.
Well, that's like, I meant like when Sinatra would record, and he'd walk in. The premise, really was, his point is, if I can sing it live, you should be able to play it perfectly every take. And I remember being there in Studio One when I got invited by Sonny Merkin, invited me down to watch Sinatra record. And I remember doing it. I was a kid. But basically, maybe he did 2 takes or 3 takes and that would be it. And one would be a master, but there wasn't a single mistake on any take. The players played flawlessly every time.
If you've seen that 60 Minutes footage from early 60s, it's him in, I think, actually what would be East West Studio One.
Yes.
Doing It Was a Very Good Year.
No, actually, that was Studio A at Ocean Way.
That was A at Ocean Way?
That was A at Ocean Way.
Okay.
Yeah.
That footage is extraordinary.
Right.
I mean, I've shown that to artists, and they have not wanted to sing for days after seeing that, being so intimidated by his performance, because it's extraordinary.
It's just so great. It's
Top to bottom,
right.
One take, like
what are you going to say?
Goosebumps,
Well, it's kind of like Ray Charles. Ray would do takes. We were doing a main title for a movie one time, and Ray's pretty straight ahead. He says, I have a deal in line. So he shows up. We have a 66-piece orchestra in Studio One, and Marty Page is doing the orchestrations. And Marty did the country record in Studio Two Studio B that Bill Putnam engineered. Anyway, and they were supposed to have a cashier's check for, I don't know, $80,000, and that's all. Anyway, and so his manager comes in, and he says, I'm here to get Mr. Charles' check. And they had a check for half that amount, and it was a company check, not a cashier's check. So then he went back, and he came back. Mr. Charles will not be joining you today, but please feel free to have him come back when you have a cashier's check for $80,000. so then we managed to get the orchestra for the next day, and Ray came back. And then, but anyway, and he comes in. It's so nice to see you. And we do a pass, and it's great. We did, I think, 1 or 2 takes. The second take was the master, and then the director's, well, do you think we have one more take? No, I think we got this nailed. This is all fine. So nice to meet you. See you later.
That's it.
Incredible.
And then Ray had a studio down on Western Avenue, and we became good friends. And I used to tell him I got him an EM250 and stuff. We had fun, and Ray still called me Mr. Engineer Man. I said, yes, Mr. Charles. And when we did Genius Loves Company, working on that record, Ray had cancer, and it was really tough to watch because he got those last vocals just barely, really. And I don't think he was gone 3 months after that. And Ray was the most fun guy. But hey, anyway.
Circling back,
yes.
For the young 19-year-old kid in recording school, can we explain who Bill Putnam was for those that don't know, and what he means to recording?
Well, Bill was, he invented the envelopmental feedback equalizer. I mean, prior to that, there really were there's a few standalone EQs, but the concept of having an EQ in the feedback loop of every channel of a console really hadn't been done. Mm-hmm. And also what he did in regard to echo chambers, at the very early years was pretty amazing. And obviously he designed all these amazing rooms. He designed all the consoles that went into the rooms. He designed the monitor systems. He designed all the compressors, the gear, and all the classic gear that we now consider, which is Universal Audio. Bill created it from scratch.
Wow. So the LA2A, the 1176, all that stuff. Wow.
Yeah, and and I only session when Bill. I did go to a Stan Kenton session that Bill did. Was the only session I actually went to Bing Crosby session one time too. Those are 2 that I actually got to be there for Bill. And he was just a fantastic mixer and balancer. And then he ended up doing all the sounds for the casinos in Vegas. Because there was a point when when he actually was working with Sinatra, and Sinatra said, Bill wasn't available sometimes, so he wanted an exclusive contract, so he'd be available to do anytime Frank wanted to do a record. And he signed on to that, and then he actually built a little setup in Palm Springs so that Frank could actually hear the 3 tracks and listen to them if he wanted to. But then Bill started getting calls at 1 in the morning and 2 in the morning and all this crazy stuff. And at one point, Frank calls him at 2 in the morning, and he picks up the phone. He says, "Who's this?" And he says, "It's Frank." I said, "Frank who?" Hangs up. They stayed friends and all, but he says that was the last long-term commitment he was going to make.
Wow.
But then when we were doing the LA Is My Lady record, and we did 2 full big band tracks with Quincy Jones in Studio A, and I never recorded Frank before, but I had a C12 set up and Frank doesn't want to be in a booth, so I just had some baffles around the back, and he walked up to it. Didn't even want our headphones really, and so but you never know, so we had run the takedown once with Quincy, and then Frank comes in and he walks up to the mic. Actually, Frank sang it on no mic right next to Quincy. Then he walks the mic and said, "Let's take it." So I'd actually never heard a word out of him.
Wow.
Now, I'd gone, of course, and I was pretty sure I had it all set up. And I also had an insert if I needed a compressor, but I didn't. I just went straight out.
Yeah.
And what blew me away with Frank was that his mic technique was so flawless.
Yes.
I mean, it was like every word was crystal clear, not a single pop. Everything was perfect, no windscreens required. And Frank used to get on like Dean's thing because Dean would occasionally pop the mic. Like, "What the hell is that?" He says, because when he was seeing these live radio shows, if you didn't make every word incredibly clear, you wouldn't come across. And so we did, and we did the 2 tracks, and they went really fast. And then we had about 5 or 6 vocals to do from the original stuff that Phil had done in New York, because they had done this session in New York at A&R Studios, and the air conditioning went out in the middle of it. It was like 100 degrees, and it was a tough group of sessions. So we ended up I did like 5 vocals after we did the initial tracking with Frank, and then we all went out to dinner, and that was fun.
Now, it's extraordinary. I mean, all those singers from that era that I ever got to work with, Etta James and so many other people, it was that one take, mic technique, flawless. And what always amazed me is their sense of dynamics, because they could work with the track, and they were like, because of their dynamics, they were almost mixing the track. In other words, singing soft when they needed to and backing off the mic when they needed to let the track come through.
Yeah.
And they, like Sinatra, grew up with live recording, live takes in the studio. So basically the record was all happening right at that moment. And it's extraordinary.
Well, it is. I mean, the talent it took. I recorded Etta James too, and she blew me away.
Yeah.
Lou Rawls was another guy like that.
Wow.
Walked out, one performance, done.
Yeah.
Actually, Nancy Wilson also was amazing. She could do that same thing. But also you talk about Phil's great sensibilities and his ability to smooth out the rough edges. The same thing, obviously, because Quincy was sort of a live-in client of mine, obviously. So when we did We Are the World, Quincy said, "Look, how do we record all these singers, choir?" So I said, "I know, I got this." So I brought M50s and I bought 4 C12s. We set the whole thing up, and I watched Quincy handle all this. And it was pretty amazing, to say, keeping everybody's ego under control and keeping a smooth hand.
And also arranging who sang what line, finding the right melody for the right key for their voices and all. It's extraordinary when you see that footage, how everybody just fits in perfectly.
Did every studio in town have a Putnam board? Because we had Studio One's first console here was
no, that was a
Alan Emick.
Oh yeah, that was Alan Emick built that.
Yeah.
Okay.
With like Longevin Electronics.
Gotcha.
But it was a custom board. That's all boards were custom back then.
Well, pretty much. I mean, because the early Capitol consoles were Longevin preamps with a custom surface. And
because they were broadcast boards originally, right?
Yeah, basically.
There was no EQs or anything.
No, basically, yeah. You had if you're lucky, you had a left, center, right switch.
Yeah.
And a volume control, right? And it was pretty limited. So it takes pretty great mixers to make that stuff deliver.
Yeah.
What's the most important lesson you learned from Bill Putnam?
Well, he was a master at understanding the physics of acoustics, right? He was actually, way beyond just an engineer. He was a very technical guy. And when we would do rooms, if we had an acoustic anomaly, Bill would walk in the room, we'd look at it, and he says, "Okay, we're at 450 hertz." He'd look and say, "Well, at that wavelength, it's going to be this surface here is causing that null," right? He would look at the physics of it. And I said, "Shit." I said, And so remember, we were in Studio B, we had some reflectance off the ceiling, so we built these plexiglass diffusers, right?
Yes, I remember them. Yep.
And it completely eliminated that issue.
Wow.
But all times where Bill and I would do a room, and we would figure out how to fix low frequency, The biggest problem you have in most control rooms is basically the bass hitting the back wall, coming and canceling the mix position. Well, Bill figured out how to make some low frequency absorbance systems that were linear down to below 40 hertz that no one had really quite done before. And we incorporated that in a number of rooms. And all of a sudden, there was one room, I think it was A&M, the room that had the 6K now in it, has SSL 6K.
Studio B.
Right. That room had a tremendous null. And so we redid the rear wall, and we were able to get it to have quite reasonable bass.
Well, I have to say, Alan, you learned your lesson well from him because Alan saved my butt some years ago. I designed a studio called Royal Tone that has since changed hands. Linda Perry had it for a while, and now it's called Sphere.
Right.
It was originally built for Alias Records and 2 rooms, and we hired this really great design team to do it. And they had this very innovative idea of not putting bass traps in the back wall, but putting them in the front and basically putting them in the floor. And it was, on paper, made a lot of sense. Right. And the thing about the room was that you could walk around the room and it was really nice and even and really, it worked, the trap. However, at the mixer position, there was an 8 dB dip at 80 cycles. So it basically meant your kick drum was non-existent when you sat in the mixer chair, which was a problem.
Was that a problem?
Yeah. We tried so much, Gary Meyerberg and I, who designed the rooms with me, to adjust things and fix things. And we finally went, we've got to put a new speaker system in. And we called Alan, and Alan came in and not only put his speaker system in, which I've always been a fan of the way those systems sounded, but with that same eye that Bill Putnam had, you looked around, made a couple of guesses, made a couple of measurements. We all knew that the RPG in the back wall was a little bit of an issue, and we needed trapping in the back wall. But we adjusted the side walls, I remember.
Because it came in like this and out and created a null.
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
Exactly.
So it was a combination of...
And I have to say, like, the room was transformed. The room sounds great, but you really learned your Bill Putnam because you came in and just... I remember you walking in and going, I got this. I'm going to fix this.
Because they were really nice studios. Actually, when Joe was there, I mean, they were fab. I thought this was beautiful.
They
rooms.
were really great.
Really
they
nice.
were with the Neve 8078 in one room and the SSL in the other room.
No,
she had a lot of great microphones, great outboard gear. Yeah,
we
did
really
it up
nice
right.
Place.
Yeah.
But it's like anything. It's like when Joe's in charge, everything's fine. But then you get some people who don't know what they're doing, get involved with it, and then all of a sudden things can go south very quickly. Mm-hmm. That's another issue we always have. You know, we even if the best laid plans, can also be fouled up if the wrong person gets in.
Yeah. In this case, it was a great experiment. It was a great plan, and it had a lot of merit. But they kind of overlooked one thing in their calculations, which if you walked around the room, sounded pretty good. It was a nice sounding room. But when you really went to work, it was a problem.
Yeah. How'd you get in Bill Putnam's life? Did you contact him? Did he reach out to you? Or you just kind of...
Well, what happened is, I'll try to make sure, but it's like Ray Combs, who was the manager of UREI, I went out there and they had a bunch of gear from United Western Studios sitting in this pile. It was like a 40-foot long slip of old Mac amps and Fairchilds and various things that they wanted to get rid of. And so I went in and I said to Ray, hey, Ray, what if I just buy the whole lot? He wanted to clear the space for production, and Bill Putnam was out of town. And so there was also a trailer in the back with that original Tube 610, not 610, but the big console that I ended up buying. Wow. And I ended up offering him $6,000 for everything, and he took it. Okay, and anyway, and then that's the console I stole in my garage mails. And so when Bill got back in town, and he said, "You what? You sold this stuff?" Well, also, what's really funny is actually I didn't really have the money, but I knew this deal was just crazy, right? So I picked it up on a Friday, and I'd sold enough gear by Monday to write him a check.
Whoa!
Oh, the check was good. I mean, a Monday.
That's great.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I rented some garages. And I had all this stuff. But I'll tell you another stupid thing. Right? We all do things that are really dumb, right? Well, this one thing I did, I had the Fairchilds, right? And I didn't know what a Fairchild was. It's old, Yeah. I took the meters out and threw them away. Oh, don't even go there. Okay, so we all make mistakes. It's a learning process. Of course, I was also, I was 17 years old, so whatever it was, so I didn't really know whatever it was, what that was. And so, anyway, but then what happened, Bill called me. He wanted to meet me. And I went in and I met him, and we just sort of clicked, and it kind of is. But then I invited him down to my garage to, eventually to hear the speakers. And he was pretty floored. And Billy came with him too, because Billy was
I know
probably
Billy
13 years old when he came down. Anyway, and he says, this is the best thing I've ever heard. And so that really prompted him to design the Uri time-aligned speaker system. So I worked with Bill on that. And if you remember that first show, the AES show, we showed those speakers. And I made up these demo tapes on an ATR 30. I call them shock tapes. It's nothing but high points of shocking moments all edited together for a demo. And then we found this room where if you open the doors, you walk right in the sweet spot. And that's, so Doug Sachs and Sinead comes in and we listened to that. And it was like, and Bill sold thousands of those things.
Yeah.
So that
Oddly enough, the studio I just worked in Vancouver, they have a, what was the 811?
The little ones, yeah.
No, so they have the big was 813s.
813s, yeah.
The 15-inch woofer and then the coax 604 type. Yeah. And they're great
pretty decent
system.
speakers. I mean, especially for that period of time when everybody was all over the map.
Yep.
They were a pretty reasonable speaker.
Yep.
But
and there was something about, and your speaker system does it, but in a much, much more flattering way.
Right.
And I think, I mean, might be wrong with this, but I think the concept back then in speaker design and even just mixing was that you really want to hear mid-range.
Yes.
You want to hear where all your instruments and all your vocals are, because you want to work out your balances in the mid-range. It's not about the bottom end or the tinkly highs. It's really about everything in the mid-range. And that's why Oratones worked for people, but even going back further, that's why Altec 604s worked for people, because it was all mid-range.
Right.
So it just made you work out your balances and make your frequency judgments. But your speakers did that in the same way, where the mid-range was super clear and you really understood what you were doing, but it wasn't fatiguing and distorted and ear damaging like some of those others were.
Well, like Rick Bacconin, who's this great engineer.
He
did Upright along with Jennifer Warren and Joe Cocker too, but he did all those.
Didn't he do the Crusaders records?
Oh, yeah, did all the Crusaders records. And they sounded just
incredible.
Great. But on the 604s at Hyder, he says, he said, it's got to kind of hurt to be right, and it did, because they were kind of bright in the mid-range, and so he actually suffered through. He figured out what he needed to do to make it sound right when he left the room.
Right, exactly.
But it wasn't 100% right when you're sitting to it, so it's a little painful going through the process. But Rick's mixes were pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, all those albums.
Oh,
in fact, he did with Kirschenbaum. Didn't he do the Joe Jackson cut?
Yeah, he had that one too. Yeah.
Night and Day. Yeah.
This guy was an amazing engineer and a great friend. And of course, I met Bernie Gremlin through Rick Bacconin. That's how we became friends. Mm-hmm. And then I talked Bernie into leaving A&M and starting Bernie on Mastering in my building.
Oh,
so Bernie was my tenant for almost
there,
18 years.
Right.
Wow. And Bernie and Claire are two of my very closest friends, and I just love them to death. And what can I say? I did a direct-to-disc over at his place maybe just before COVID. We did the whole band out in his thing, direct-to-disc. I got an API 1604. We did straight to the cutter. We only did 4 songs in a row instead of like 5 songs in a row, but so I did that with him not too long ago.
When you bought, was it Studio B at Western from Putnam?
Yes.
What was your goal? Did you have goals then, or you just kind of...
Well, making
moves.
My garage was a really nice room, and I enjoyed it a lot. But of course, I was also working at Fox on the Fox scoring stage. So that was nice too. And so I wanted space. I loved the sound. Of course, dead rooms had kind of taken over, and they were all small rooms. Even when George built the complex, I mean, they were really dead rooms. And I wanted because he came from Hollywood Sound, and of course, they were small rooms. And of course, you can't complain. The Earth, Wind, and Fire record sounded pretty goddamn good.
So impressive.
But those are all API, the Bushnell API consoles too, at Hollywood Sound. And that's another whole story. But anyway, I'm sorry, where were you?
No, just when you're a young man like that, what were you out to do in life? I mean, obviously just take over studios or...
Well, no, it was for me, it was just, I just love great sound. And so for me, originally those studios were, I started recording because I needed great sounding stuff to play on my speakers. And that's, early on, I remember it was a friend of mine named Jack Waltz, who, of course, was one of my managers, but he was the chief tech for Taddeo. And I remember, as a kid, I used to go over and hang out at Taddeo on the dub stage, and when they were dubbing motion pictures and stuff. But one time I was in the tech shop, and he opened a door, and it had all these microphones. And I said, whoa. And there were 8 Cine Church mics in there. and there was a bunch of 67s and some Sheps and all kinds of stuff. He said, yeah, we don't use this stuff anymore. We used to record the music for the Taddeo motion pictures, and this stuff is left over.
Wow.
And when Michael Todd died, we stopped doing this. And I said, oh, okay. And I remember I was friends with Morris Kessler, who made the SA equalizers, which I sort of liked. So I said, well, how about I make some trades? So I ended up trading some SA equalizers, and I got all these mics. And so was in my first studio. I had 8 church mics, and then
you should explain what a church mic is.
Well, a church mic. This guy Stan Church, who worked for MGM, decided he could make a better version of B47, and so it had a 6072 tube instead of the VF14, but it also had super high polarizing voltage in the capsule, like 275 volts on the polarizing voltage in the capsule. But it swung a lot of current, and it basically was like a U47, but it was even more shocking. It had even more attack. And it was impervious to overload. You could not overload the mic. It was just incredible.
Yeah, I've only used them a couple of times, and they were pretty extraordinary. It really was a U47 on steroids.
Exactly.
Yeah, a little more open.
Yeah,
just punchier. Really impressive, especially for any kind of orchestral recording. Really, really great when you need distance.
Oh, we had a Fox. I mean, you put I remember one time you put a couple of these church mics out in front of, say, the trumpets, 4 trumpets and 4 bones. So you pull up the fader with the 2 mics. You go, wow, that's shocking. You know what I mean?
Do we have a church mic here?
No.
No church mic?
No
How many
church
did he
mics.
make? You know?
You know, I think maybe 60 or so. Huh. I don't think it's all ever made.
How many do you still have?
Not anymore. And you know, what is the weird thing is that I had these mics, and I started having capsule problems. Some going bad, and Stephen Temmer had the Neumann thing, and you could not get a replacement capsule.
Oh.
So I ended up selling them off while they were still working.
Huh.
You know, I'm depressed I didn't keep a couple of them, but you know, what can I say? But of course, I had a lot of mics, so it wasn't necessarily a huge issue.
Yes, Ocean Way had one of the most extraordinary mic collections, like Sunset or Blackbird, and always in great shape.
Everything
always
worked.
Great sounding.
Well, you know, it's funny. I was at Abbey Road doing a score not that long ago in the big room, right? And they have a pretty great mic collection, but even surprised me as time progressed, a lot of it isn't working. I mean, they have because I love KM54s, and it was hard to find this incredible microphone.
Yep.
But you know, it's and it's a great studio and everything else. But you know, and they have enough microphones that you can still get M50s, you can still get 54s. But you know, it's not like it was in the early years when the maintenance was just on fire, as it was for every studio.
Yeah.
And of course, what I love about this place, if I may say, is that generally everything works. And having a lovely 8068 console, because I just mix in this room.
88.
88. Listen, I just love that board. And I love this. I just love this whole place. I mean, for me, the joy, I'm so thrilled that this place is going and operating, and I can walk in the courtyard and see Joe. And all my friends.
It is one of the pluses here is that there is really, really a great sense of community. It's always great walking outside and seeing, you know, who's ever your neighbor at that point in time. And, you know, you exchange stories and techniques and tricks, and it's great. It's
that
fantastic.
was the joy of, I mean, in the hallways, that was the fun part. And, you know, I've worked in this room. I'm when the Bushnell API was in here, the original board, worked in there many times, worked in all the rooms, and I've always loved this place. You know, one thing I did do is I think I worked at almost every studio in LA over a period of time, and I'm sure Joe did too. And, you know, I just am so thrilled that this place is intact, that you kept us all going, and that we have this as an asset, because it's just incredibly valuable, if I may say.
And like, to me, the reason that you come to a professional commercial recording facility that you perhaps don't have in your home is an extraordinary sounding room.
Yes.
And a great sounding studio, a great sounding tracking room makes any instrument come alive.
Exactly.
And these rooms really are such complements to instruments where, you know, you can do all the same stuff in your bedroom, in your basement, wherever it might be. But most often I find people don't have environments that let instruments really speak. And the thing about these rooms is that stuff comes alive, and the Bill Putnam rooms as well. I don't know. I'm really surprised to know that he was such a technician and mathematician, because when you look at those rooms, they kind of look like they were put together with very basic knowledge of acoustics. They really look. I'm sure there's many things behind the scenes that I've never noticed, but they look very, very basic in design, but they sound extraordinary.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things Bill did too is he managed to get very good low frequency control below 400 hertz. So in the room, even if it was one or it was in B, with an orchestra, even with bass drums, everything's in control. Everything's, because he's got, you can't see that. That's all hidden behind displays and panels. His low frequency absorption is in the room. But also, like in B and A, there's complete, there's no parallel planes. Everything is non-parallel.
Right.
And it's a pretty sophisticated piece of engineering, really. And, it's like when we did the Ocean Way Room plugins, that became, a pretty successful thing for me.
Still one of my, in fact, I was using it just yesterday. One of my favorite plugins. Still, it works, and it does sound Studio B because
those rooms inside
I knew
and out.
B so well. Jack Joseph Puig was in A for so long that you could hardly ever get in that room.
Yeah.
So I know B better than I know Studio A, and the plugin really captures it. It's pretty great.
Well, it's funny because there's this new Blood, Sweat, and Tears documentary that I was working on. And there are these original 8-track tapes that they recorded in Eastern Europe. We thought they were all lost, but we found them in the Academy Archive. So I was remixing them at Capitol, but I needed them in 7.1. And basically it's a 7-track recording, And with the Ocean Way Room plugin, what I'm able to do is I have a mono drum track, but if I put Ocean Way Room left and right, it sounds like it's recorded in stereo. And then I take a second Ocean Way plugin and I put it in the left, right, rear. So I think I had Studio A in the rear, Studio B in the front. I mean, it sounds like I'm goddamn in the actual. And I said, I couldn't know how I could even dream of anything like that.
Yeah.
And so this really helped me. I mean, I use that myself, a lot of things. So it's been.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible, really, where plug-in technology has come. I mean, IK has captured these rooms, and the modeling they did for Studio 2 here, it sounds just like this room. It's really almost eerie when I put an instrument in it. It really feels like I'm in this room.
Yeah, what did Nico say about, what did he do? He remixed For What It's Worth, but in Studio One.
With the Studio One plugin, with the chamber,
in the actual room, and used the plugin to remix For What It's Worth, Buffalo Springfield.
Oh my God,
Studio One.
Well,
when's the first time you came to Sunset Sound? Do you remember Paul's father? Did you have a relationship with Tootie?
I think I met your dad at least once, but it's been a long time.
So.
Yeah. But I'll tell you, it's a funny, like we talk about like Don Landy, who was another engineer who I was a huge fan of. And I met Don, there was a studio called Sun West.
Sun West.
That was down the street, and Don was the manager of Sun West. And I remember I had an 8-track recording, and I went in there to mix it in the studio I think I had an electric console, had some custom monitors. And it kind of sounded pretty good. And Don was hanging out with me, right? And he was also friends with my friend Dennis Dragon, if you remember Dennis. Anyway, we're mixing this one song, and I realized, God, we're missing about a bar and a half of bass. I said, where the hell did it go? I don't know. So I said, that's a problem. But anyway, he said, no, that's not a problem, Don says. So we had an MM1000 with 8-track heads on it, and we listened to it. So Don takes a piece of 1/4-inch machine right here, and we find another spot on the song that has the same bass thing. Yeah. Transfer to 1/4-inch, and then we sync it up and line it up. We try it 2 or 3 times, and finally gets a perfect punch, puts the bass piece in. And he does this in from beginning to end, it took 26 minutes. and I feel like, Don, this guy he's...
And it would happen in 2.6 seconds now in Pro Tools.
I mean, I was so blown away. And then he had also done this record BFI, which was with Daryl Dragon, who was Captain Deal, and Dennis, and it sounded absolutely amazing. This is very early. I think so. I'm a huge fan, of course. When he did listen, what was the one with the phasing? Was it Listen to the Music?
Listen to the music, yeah.
Right.
With the whole thing, the whole track phase.
And he had the 224 tracks, and he's doing the VSO thing. Is like,
so the phasing was done on 224s, not the mix.
That's correct. And then he edited the piece into the finished thing.
Because I always wondered, because some instruments sound phased and some don't, how they did that. So it was the
24 tracks being phased and then cutting that piece into the mix.
Amazing.
And then Don, not only did he record, he mastered all his own stuff. He mastered all the Deep Brothers records. He mastered himself, as well as recording them all.
Did he master the Van Halen records?
Not here. We didn't have mastering then. But I think he oversaw that at Warner's.
Yeah, no, he actually cut the actual lacquers himself.
Yeah.
He was totally into, Don was,
We started this show kind of because of Don Land. It used to be about Van Halen, and then we kind of started touching down in other areas. And he called me like 6 months ago now and started giving me pointers on all the things that I was saying that weren't correct. And he said he'd come in and talk to Ted Templeman too, and they're going to come in and do this. But he was sharp as a tack.
I mean, the first time I heard What a Fool Believes, I think I heard it in the radio. I stopped the car just to listen to the mix because I was so blown away with it.
All those albums he did.
I mean, you know, and he's a lovely guy. I mean, but I mean, what can I say? He's just so talented.
Yeah.
Who's another engineer that you found just incredibly mind-blowing that really inspired you and just...
Well, that was just Bill Schnee.
Yeah.
I mean, Bill Schnee, you know, obviously he did those directed discs for Doug, and I was around for that, but he did some records, you know.
Pablo Cruz.
Oh, I mean, yeah. Just so many great records that sounded
Barbra
so amazing.
Streisand,
the Barbra Streisand duet with
Ringo.
The Ringo record's in here.
Yeah.
Oh, tell him the story, Paul. So 2 days ago.
Yeah, this was so for 30 years I've been trying to get the photos on the session here with Ringo and Goodnight Vienna because they took photos of all the, you know, they had Elton John, Klaus Voormann, you know, George Harrison came down. It was crazy who was on this session. And I'd seen them on the album cover, but I was never able to get them. Capitol was like, I don't have them or whatever. Ringo comes down here like 10 years ago to see this band that is recording here. And I asked him, and he's like, oh, I don't know where those are. I said, well, can you get me a gold record? Because we don't even have your gold record. Oh, yeah, I'll call my manager. We'll get it for you. That never happened.
Right.
Anyway, so Bill Schnee calls me the other day.
Yeah.
It's sort of for a favor. So I said, Bill, you know, you sent me a picture about a month ago of a session, of the Ringo session in this room. I go, where'd you get that? He goes, well, I just happen to have that one. And I said, don't you know where the rest of them are? Isn't there a guy named Larry Emrine? I kind of tracked that down.
I remember that guy.
Yeah.
You know, I think he sells coffee now or something.
Studio
He had
55.
that 5, right.
Yeah.
So he goes, well, I'm really close with Larry. He goes, let me call him up and see if he's got the photos. Lo and behold, 2 days later, he sends me all the photos.
Oh, my God.
So now I've got all the photos. I got John Lennon in the booth here with Ringo.
Oh, my God.
I mean, they're amazing pictures.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So, and then Larry said, feel free to use them. So,
Super high quality, too.
Yeah.
They're great. It's
Well,
amazing.
you know, because we just, back then we just didn't take pictures. Generally, all those great sessions that they're not, with the cell phone.
now,
Everybody-
who had a camera?
Everybody wanted it private too, you know.
That was another thing.
Yeah.
They didn't want their pictures
Yeah.
taken.
Because all those Lionel Richie sessions we did and all those Michael Jackson stuff, we didn't really take hardly any
Yeah,
pictures.
even in fact, the first time I came to Sunset was a very young engineer. I was working with Frank Zappa. That was my first time. We worked in Studio One, and you and I have both done Frank Zappa albums. So I've told all my stories many times, but I'd love to know all the Frank Zappa stories that you have.
What record?
Because you took over kind of after I left. Yeah.
Well, Frank, he came to my studio, and we were doing this song. They're thinking of drafting women into the Army. And he had a song called I Don't Want to Get Drafted, Getting Shot in the Foxhole, something on those lines, which is very Frank Zappa. And so, but Vinny was in the band and Steve Vai was in the band. And so they came in. That's where I met Vinny for the first time, I think, and Steve. And of course, Steve is now one of my close friends. But, and we cut this track and it came out really great. And then we mixed that. And then we did all sorts of stuff. Then I went to Boston, re-recorded tracks and bands. Then I worked up at the studio at the house. And I really loved Frank. He was a lot of fun, but he wanted so much time. And I finally reached a point that says, Frank, I love this. I love being with you. I have so much fun. Like one time we had the echo chamber at the house. He says, here's what I want to do. I've got this EMU synthesizer. It's got 8 outputs. I want to put 8 speakers in the echo chamber. I want to put 5 microphones. That's fine, Frank. We're still getting everything mixed. Let me come back to that. And he just, but
Sounds like Frank.
But he's the best. I mean, and we stayed close even after that, and we would talk on the phone and stuff. And but I just couldn't put any more time in. Then funny because Lady Gaga bought the house, and then I went up and did speakers for Lady Gaga, right, in that control room. And that control room had a pretty big null, also between front to back. And so I ended up putting these extra subs in and balanced the whole thing out. And I have one position for her sitting on the couch and one position for the mix position when you actually hear what's going on to get that whole thing balanced out. But it actually came out pretty good. Mm-hmm. It's a good system.
I worked up there a few times, and it was pretty good, actually.
Yeah.
That was Rudy Brewer, I think, designed the
That's
room.
right. Had the sunken drum booth.
That's right. Yep.
It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Dweezil was on here, I don't know, last year on the show and said that Gaga thought that was the console that Frank had, but they just replaced it to kind of sell the
No,
house.
we had, because originally what was it had a Harrison.
It was a Harrison first because
and then
we were working at Village all the time.
That's right.
And they had Harrisons, and he loved the Harrison. Mm-hmm. So that was the first console he bought for Utility Muffin Research Kitchen, as it was called.
Yes, that's right. That's
right. And then there was a V-Series, right?
Right. They put the VR in there early, and that was a mistake because the Harrison was actually much better than the V was. Yeah. I mean, obviously, Bruce did pretty good with the Harrison console. Yeah. Thriller sounds fine. Yeah. But I would say one thing about like a Bruce Swedien, and we talk about the Orotone. Bruce really did like to have great big speakers and listen to everything else. But when he was all done with the mix, he would listen to one Orotone in mono at about 65 dB. And he says, can I hear every hook? Is there a line that I cannot hear? He's not really using it to balance. He's just to make sure that if anybody's standing there, there's something in there that's critical to the song that I can't hear.
So he didn't spend a lot of time working on that one?
No, he just really, it was like, is there anything I'm missing? So if you're in a supermarket and you hear one speaker on the side, am I not hearing that guitar hook that Paul Jackson did or something that is part of it? And so it was impressive to watch how he did that. At one time, I mean, I was there and he had just finished, he was doing Back on the Block at Quincy, and he had done this song with Take 6. And it was in Studio B, which at that point had the double 8078, in there. It was an 80 input 8078 in Studio B. And I remember, he says, come on in, I want you to hear this. And I remember I sat down next to Bruce, and he pushes play. I mean, it was so shocking sounding. We were laughing. It was so impressive. And I go like, my God, that's just amazing, And, we just, I'm sure we have been in occasionally at the control room where there's just a moment in time when everything is right.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, that doesn't always translate to the finished mix. Because for whatever reason, there's something going on and everything is perfect. And it's just like, I can't explain how it happens. And sometimes we get that on tape and sometimes we don't. But Bruce became a very dear friend of mine and we had so much fun over the years. And Quincy too. Quincy was just fantastic.
Such a gentleman. Just incredible person.
Was that the most successful time in recording, obviously, financially, the 80s, 70s, 80s? I mean, this place was...
Well, I think it was a booming time. It was before people really had home studios because home studios, you needed tape machines then.
Yes.
And most people couldn't have 24
Keeping those
tracks.
things working?
Exactly. But then when we moved into digital, then it changed.
What kind of was the year that happened? 90?
Yeah, what do you think? 90s?
Yeah, I mean, there was, Well, of course, things, you'd have moments like even then, I mean, in the early years, the other thing I really missed was with the dual and triple 24-track lockups.
Oh, that was a lot of fun. I don't miss that at all.
Triple 24 tracks.
Yeah, well, because, I mean, from a studio owner standpoint, that was a nice accoutrement.
Well, let's talk about that. Bad, which you did at your studio, Michael Jackson. Tell us about the amount of time that they put into that record. And
well,
also,
I mean, I'll tell you what's funny. One time Michael comes into Record One, right, and he comes in this beat-up old van. And he walks up, he's got the dark glasses with a phony plastic nose. And he says, do you think anyone's going to recognize me? I says, yes, Michael, they're still going to know it's you. This isn't going to work. You have to go up here in disguise. But Michael was very sweet. We really had a great time in those periods. But, I mean, it was pretty crazy. When Quincy was around, things were pretty controlled. Things was very fine. But when Quincy stopped being involved, it got pretty crazy.
How so?
Well, Mike would have 3 rooms booked, right? And you're all waiting for him to show up. And then might book for a week. Everybody's waiting, paying, and like, I think it was on Dangerous. I think that Michael had a pretty great deal with CBS. I think at $18 million up front for each record, non-recoupable. But on Dangerous, we actually exceeded that number. And so I got paid from CBS for the first $18 million, but then after that, it was MJJ Productions. And that became a little more difficult to collect than it was from thing. And at one point, I think Michael owed me $1 million. And then his accountant was also been Neil Diamond's accountant. We lived in Palm Springs. And I called him up and I says, I love Michael, I don't want to do this, but I'm going to have to get paid here or else I'm going to lock the doors. And I did get paid and everything was fine. And And we did a lot of records with Michael, and everything was fine, but, we do need to pay my employees. I do need to work, and, But we had so much fun during the Michael Jackson era. We had two chefs, the microbiotic chef and the soul food chef. So you could have ribs in one hand and organic in the other.
Wow.
So
Wow, that is cool.
It was great. And then it was like a candy store. We had a whole candy store set up. It was like going into a movie theater, and you walked in, it was all set up. And then Michael's office was crazy. He had like all these toys and dolls, all this crazy stuff. And then you walk in one day, and Harry Kissinger there, or Katharine Hepburn's there, or Steven Spielberg's there, or every day was just crazy.
This is Record One?
This is at Record One and Ocean Way. He had one room at Ocean Way and two at Record One booked almost continually for years.
Wow.
And
then you had Drake come in after that.
And then, Dre was, when Michael finally finished up, then Dre came in and took over Record One for an extended period. And we did, In the Club and all that stuff together. And, just a bunch of records for Dre.
Great records.
Great records. And and Dre's a great guy. And that was a very good time, too.
Mm-hmm. Does Dr. Dre own Record One now?
Yeah. What happened is he really wanted to buy Record One, but that was before he was a billionaire, right? And he didn't want to pay what I wanted, but then he became a billionaire, and things were easier to negotiate terms.
It all worked out.
Well, also, I think when I bought Record One, you guys were in the bidding, too, for that, weren't you?
Yeah.
Huh. What year was that?
85?
I think something like that, yeah.
It was 85.
Oh, I have a question. We want to figure out how Paul thinks that you might have been on vacation when he got Sound Factory and wonders why you weren't there in the war.
I missed the boat. Okay.
I don't know how that happened.
Yeah. Well, of course, Dave Hassinger was amazing, because Val, when he built Record One, really, it was very much like this, copy. It's made bigger, but it was the same thing. Yeah, exactly.
To the number, to the inch.
Well, also, you think in terms of those recordings that Val did at the time, is like, you had Russ Conkle and Scholar. These guys it doesn't get better.
Right. And Peter Asher producing all those records.
And so if you can't get a good sound with those guys, you might as well just hang it up. But Hassinger really was excellent, and he knew how to say, and Val learned from him. Yeah. And you did, use a 251 every time. How bad can that be? And Val made some good records, no question about it.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Motels and Linda Ronstadt.
When they were building
Taylor.
Record One, I know Val had Nico book Sound Factory and came in with a measuring tape and measured everything for him.
True.
We were like, "What are you doing?"
True.
Val's doing he's building a studio. Wants to have everything exact.
Wow.
Yeah. So true. Oh, yeah.
But how come, still, why weren't you after Sound Factory?
Well, because, of course, at that point, I think I was building Ocean Way Nashville. I'm not sure what exact period of time that was. I think I had my hands pretty full. So I just, you can only do so much. And at one point I had 18 rooms going, including that.
Oh,
But we also had this thing, Ocean Way to Go, where Rick Rubin was a great client of mine. So I had the Houdini house up on Laurel.
You did Blood
Fully
Sugar
equipped
Sex
that.
Magic up there?
Yeah, no, we set up a whole studio. I had I think, was it an 8068, and then I put video cameras in all the control rooms, and I acoustically treated every space. And so we had one in Malibu full time as well. So we had the Ocean Way to Go thing was quite, and we staffed it, and we fixed the rooms up.
At the house that was near the Dalai Lama's house. Was that the house that Rick had?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think that's where it is. Right.
Yeah, I forgot what canyon that is. Yeah.
In Malibu?
Right. So we did. So that was another part of our business. But
Wow.
it was a
I
crazy.
totally
time.
forgot about.
I got to hear about
Way,
that, though.
Ocean Way, Nashville. You should talk about that because that's an. Speaking of extraordinary rooms, that's a stunning sounding tracking room.
Oh, yeah.
Great sounding control room, great sounding console. The monitors, it's really, I haven't worked there in a long time, but that was a find. Church.
Mark Knopfler said it's like the best rock tracking room. He loved that room too. But the thing is when, originally that whole deal was going to be Glenn Johns and Bill Schnee and I we're going to do this kind of studio group. We were going to do one in London, one in New York, and then Ocean Way would be LA, and then we're going to do it in Nashville. And it was coming along pretty smoothly, but as things happened, the funding sort of faded away. Mm-hmm. So I ended up building it myself. Wow. And so Schnee and I were looking all over the place trying to find a place to...
And how did you find that church?
Well, it was tied as a kind of a crooked evangelist named Tony Alama, who basically had this church, but he was in jail, and it was all tied up in litigation. And so I think maybe Massenberg and I, we maybe snuck in the back window, and we walked in the room. I said, "Oh my God, this place is crazy!" And then it had two buildings. It had the main building and the rectory building right next to it. It had about almost 19,000 square feet, and it was right on Music Row, and it was exactly what I wanted. But I kind of given up because you couldn't make a deal. But anyway, then all of a sudden, one attorney got control of it for a short time, and Gary Bells went out. We bought the thing before anybody knew what happened, and we got this amazing place. And then when I had it all designed in my head, exactly how the control was going to go. And we have the twin ISOs on both sides have like 18-foot ceilings with skylights. Wow. Yep. We built two more ISOs in the front with skylights. So we had 4 ISOs, and then, they do all the electronic game scores. They have like 70-piece orchestras in there, and it's really, their place is just cranking.
Wow.
But I just went back and completely rebalanced and reset up Studio A monitors. It's back to the way it was when even better, actually.
They were pretty extraordinary sounding speakers, because I remember tracking in there, and that's maybe one of the only times in my life that I never used any other set of monitors. I had my Tannoy Golds with me,
right,
and I remember taking them down off the console because they interfered with the sound of the mains.
Incredible.
And to track a whole album, nothing but the big speakers, and you could run them quite. Most big speakers, the efficiency, if you will, doesn't kind of falls apart at low volume, so you might not really hear the woofers kick in or anything. But those speakers, you could run them super quiet and make little details on overhead mics or whatever it was while you were tracking. That was still is, I'm sure, a stunning control room. Really great monitor system.
Well, that was the thing. You have to defeat the Fletcher-Munson curve, because it's depending on how you treat the room acoustically, so that actually when you're playing a low level, the speakers actually work a little harder than you might think, and it gives you it makes the low end match.
Yes.
So exactly, you can play. You're sitting there at 75 or 80 dB, and it sounds just like it does at 105. You maintain that sensibility, and that's part of the joy of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Now Belmont University owns that with you, or they own it outright?
I have a licensing with Belmont, so I'm still involved with it, and my entire staff stayed in place. In fact, I was just there working, redoing things and this. So I worked there. I mean, I did a Faith Hill album not that long ago there, and so I still work at the studios. I still love it, and I love Belmont. They're great. They're great things. So I'm still involved, but it is owned by Belmont University, and that kind of came up. Mike Kerb, who was a client of ours, was about to donate, I think, $12 million for them to build a new entertainment venue, and I says, Mike, forget that. We're basically 3 blocks from the campus, and it was unique in that it was a full commercial studio to be attached to university, and that had never happened before. So we ended up making a deal with Belmont, and I was transitioning out of the studio business and really becoming a manufacturer, even though I'm still making records, but I'm more of a manufacturer than I am a studio owner, obviously.
I want to just go back 10 minutes. Ocean Way to Go. Digital comes into play, and Paul explained that you came up with a system to put studios anywhere anybody wanted to record in a home, and then obviously
that was it. Is it for me, and of course Joe would know this too, is that with some moving blankets and the proper acoustic, it's amazing what you can do.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because in the end we got to make it work, and so part of it was not just setting up a studio, but making all the spaces work sonically, so that they're in control and that it's going to do what you need to do. So that was part of our...
Yeah, we rented your 1604 to go up to the Paramore house to do an album. We built a whole control room in what were the stables for the Paramore estate. And that little 1604 that kicked butt. Those consoles, those little API consoles, I think there just must have been no circuitry in them or something about them.
Sounded killer.
That they were so punchy. In fact, Ocean Way B had the little 1604 there as well.
Yeah, we had actually, because the original dot console was only 32 bits, so we had a 1604 sitting next to it. But the other thing we did too is on the Dalcon console, we had 40 API 550As normal to every input, as well as the EQ that's in the console. You had 6 bands and 30 frequencies for every channel.
It was pretty extraordinary, I have to say, because whatever those EQs that were in the console, were they Spectrasonics or something?
Well, it was kind of based on that, but they were custom made.
Okay.
But they certainly had some attack.
Yes, they had a sound, but they were very open, very, very sweet, very hi-fi, if you will.
Right.
And then you had the APIs that were accessible via a button.
Right.
that are much more aggressive.
Right.
So you were able to maybe kind of mix and match your EQs on every channel, where you could get the aggressive mid-range from the API, but the nice open top from the console, or whatever it was that suited you. And then the preamps on that too were just very open and not a lot of gain, I remember.
Yeah.
But something about that console was extraordinary.
Well, the thing that's crazy about that console is, imagine this console from microphone in to bus out, you went through 3 preamps in the entire console. And the equalizer was in the feedback loop with the line amp. So basically, if you put the EQ in or out, there was no electronics.
Wow.
It was passive. So individual coils for each frequency. And then even the API 550As, they were totally bypassed unless you pushed the button in.
Right, I remember that, yes.
So you basically weren't going through
any of the electronics.
It's incredible. And then another thing, the console ran on plus or minus 22 volt rails. And it'll deliver plus 25 out without a transformer. Full out. And so the output, we had 1-to-1 transformers plus a direct out. So you could have a balanced or unbalanced, but you didn't have to go through any transformer if you wanted to.
Huh.
And also the amplifiers in that console slewed at 200 volts per microsecond. So Massenburg called it the fastest console on planet Earth, and then Chris Lord-Alge called it the baseball bat console because it was so goddamn punchy.
Wow. And now Nigel Godrich has got that
Nigel,
in his basement.
Well, just like when this console left, you'd prefer it didn't stay in L.A.
That's right.
We were the same way. Our consoles in London, in Nigel's studio, because we did these Radiohead records, and we did all the Beck records. And then Beck, I had this fight between Beck and John Bryant and Nigel, but I had promised it to Nigel first. And that was also the furthest distance. So I ended up selling it to Nigel Goodrich, who's a lovely guy, and
Was
How
there
many of
anybody
those consoles were there?
Well, here's the thing: he built one portable one, which was 24 inputs with a sidecar, and Bill Putnam ended up installing that in one of the rooms, and all the engineers liked it. They thought it sounded great. So he says, "Well, good, let's build 3 of these, and there are going to be 3 custom consoles." So he built the first one, and then into the production, but there were some issues. And they installed it in Studio One, and if you looked at this console sideways, it went into oscillation, and all the meters would pin. And I think Armin Steiner did some of the first sessions in there in that thing, and the console sounded amazing. But you turn the EQ limits, and all the faders all the meters would pin, and so it lasted 1 month. They pulled it out, and so it was sitting at UA, and I said to Bill, I might be interested in buying that. And so I worked that I did with him, and I bought it from Bill. And then I took it to my garage, and then Jake Hoffman and I spent 2 months stabilizing it. And because, you see, it had bandwidth out to half a meg, so we settled at 100K bandwidth. And then we basically figured out how to reground everything, and we made it work great in my garage. And then I moved that console from the garage to Studio B.
Amazing.
Oh, that's how it came to be.
That's how it came to be.
But that was the last one built?
Only one. Because Bill,
Only
after that one turned out to be a disaster, they obviously
didn't
canceled
build
the
the other
contract
two.
and never got built. So it is the only one. And then the green console, the custom one, that went to, and Beck has that.
Oh.
He bought that custom console from Dennis Dragon because I sold to Dennis after that. So they all makes a circle, really. Makes a circle. Because, anyway.
Did you have any competition with Ocean Way to Go at that time when you started doing this,
there wasn't anybody doing that.
Exactly. How'd you have the insight to...
Well, it's just that we had so many clients, who they said, "Well, can I record in this house?" And I said, "Yeah, we can make it work." And then and also we had these we call care packages with like a Red Cross, so like because we had so much gear, if they went to Capitol and they needed a bunch of C12s or mics they didn't have, we would roll these carts in that had everything they'd possibly want. Because the other thing too is because I bought all these studios, I was able to just amass this huge collection of gear that, honestly, I probably could have never afforded to buy. Because like even when Tootie was building these studios and Bill was building this, you go over to like, CBS and they had 10 C12s and 10 M49s and 12 47s and all these mics. Bill had maybe 5 47s, right? And because we didn't have those unlimited budgets. Right. And so you had to use your wits about it. But also, I remember when I was working at Western Recorders, I worked there for a month. And then one thing, we were doing, I think Ricky Nelson's Garden Party was being done. And I remember Mike Shields, Captain Newman, was doing that. And I thought that sounded pretty impressive, even at that time. But most of the stuff I walked into, I wasn't really impressed with until I walked into Studio One and Lee Hirschberg was doing Summer 42. And I had been in this room, dozens of times. I never heard anything I liked. And I walked in there, and it sounded insane. It was just incredible. But because Warner Brothers had their headquarters at United Western Studios, Lee got what he wanted. So every condenser mic in the store was on his session. So everybody else had RCAs and Shures.
Oh, interesting.
He didn't use those mics. He used every good mic there. And then the crazier thing is, because of the union issues like your dad was having, Bill was having the same sort of problems. And it was becoming very difficult to do business. And in the same respect, if you think in terms of what went across with CBS, there's a great story about Paul Simon working in these studios over here at the CBS studios. And they were doing a take of a song, and they finished the song, and they looked in the booth, and they were gone. They had turned off the machines and went to a coffee break in the middle of a take.
Oh, jeez.
No.
Yeah.
Because it was a union
Yeah,
break.
and also, I mean, Paul can be, fairly aggressive, whatever else, and I guess they didn't like him, so, and so that
They didn't
became,
care.
and so Clive ended up closing all of the CBS studios because the clients just wouldn't work there. They liked the kind of service that you guys provided, and so United. So what Bill did is Jerry Barnes, remember Jerry and Joe
Yes,
Barnes?
of course, yeah.
He says, "Look, they're gonna rent it from me, and I'm no longer." And the contract was voided, and then they ran the studios.
Oh.
But what's really interesting, when Jerry and Joe were running it, like everybody wanted new technology, they didn't want any of those old tube mics. All they wanted was 414s and 451s. So I said, no problem. I'll trade you 414s, 451s for the U47s and 251s. And so I got all those mics out of Western. And had I not done that, the mics at Sinatra and stuff would have been gone. I had them all in my collection.
All points of the universe.
So when I went back in, they all came back.
Wow.
So, we had all those, and so my appreciation, that was the same thing at the time I was buying all those tube mics from Europe. Remember Dan Alexander?
Very well.
Dan, I said,
I
Dan.
bought many mics from Dan.
Well, I said, well, hey, Dan. Dan said to me, why don't you fund me? It was a GoFundMe project. And I says, absolutely. So I funded him in Europe, and we bought at least 1,000 mics.
Wow.
From the BBC alone, I bought 50 M50s and 49s from the BBC in one buy.
Wow.
I bought from Oster Runderfunkt. I think I bought 20 C24s and 60 KM54s and 40 C12As. And that's when I bought that 251 stereo mic.
Stereo, one
from
and
the
only
Society of
stereo
Austrian
mic,
Sound Hunters. We bought that one.
Wow.
But so we were just buying this stuff up, and they were throwing it away.
They were just off and all of it, huh?
Well, here's the difference between, like, in Europe, it's all government sponsored. So they spend all your money to buy the best mics.
Yeah.
In the United States, they're buying EV insurers.
Right. And the same thing in Japan. I remember people telling me stories in Japan that, especially Japan, they're all about, the best technology is the new technology.
Right.
It doesn't matter what happened in the past. But the guys would tell me that NHK, the national radio, how when they decided that tubes were bad, that they basically were taking Pultecs and U67s and everything and just putting them in the dumpster. They were just trashing all this gear, LA2As, all that stuff went in the dumpsters, and all the engineers, of course, went and picked up stuff. But I remember one guy actually gave me some API modules that came out of an API console that NHK had trashed because they were putting in an SSL or whatever modern console they were putting in,
Shocking.
I remember working at Toshiba EMI, and they had nice API consoles mixing.
That was a good
rooms.
studio.
Very nice studio.
Yeah, I remember that.
Well, I actually bought a number of 8078s out of,
oh, that's right, because I worked on the
site.
one in Roppongi, the CBS Roppongi 8078.
Right.
And isn't that now part of Nashville console? No. It's somewhere.
Yeah, because I built the two big double 8078s, and I think two of them came from Hitsville. One came from the Village, was the Fleetwood Mac console, and then one came from a scoring stage in Japan that I bought out. And that's how those four 8078s. But then I had another 87, had some other ones too, but that's how they all, every has a history, comes from someplace.
Yeah, because 8078s, there were only 20, 30 made, not many.
Not many.
Yeah.
Paul, there's an interesting story. I live in Hermosa Beach, and when I was in film school, I used to take the subway up here, and Paul told me the other day that the subway was going to run right down Sunset Boulevard.
Yeah.
That was interesting because
that was a scary time.
Would that have put Sunset and your
probably
studio out of business?
Probably would have put us out of business.
Well, I love they had this. What happened is with Metrorail, which is the most expensive rail system ever built by mankind.
Yeah.
Anyway, they had run out of money, and they said we're going to have to go above ground at Western Avenue and go down Sunset all the way to Highland, I forget where it was. And they were going to basically have above ground rail. They were going to eliminate all parking and all turn lanes on Sunset. And the noise. Think of all of the stages and the studios and all. And so we basically fought it, And I actually had meetings with Mayor Bradley. I had meetings with Nate Holden and all these people. And I said, Nate, what's the deal here? And he says, well, when they did Metrorail, the route they chose wasn't even on the list because originally it was going to go from Santa Monica to downtown, which made sense. And I said, well, Nate, why didn't they just... And also, with the amount of money they spent, they could have put above-ground rail on the 405. They could have made a complete circle.
Exactly.
With the money they spent.
Yes.
And they didn't.
Yeah.
But anyway, finally, we basically forced them to go underground.
I think what happened, what I remember, was KTLA came on board with us, and they had big clout, compared to, smaller recording facilities like ours. But when KTLA came on board, they actually stood up and listened.
Yeah.
And that's when they routed it up to Hollywood Boulevard.
So thank God for that, because, you can imagine the rumble and noise from those trains going by would have put us all...
Not to mention the construction.
Oh.
It would have been...
But they had these beautiful pictures of like plants hanging from the bottom of the thing, as if this was going to be a beautiful improvement to Sunset with no parking and no turn lanes.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, well, because obviously we were both part of that because we both had a lot on.
Dodged the bullet.
We did.
Alan, how did you balance your personal life when you're just constantly working and...
You mean 14 hours a day is a problem, 7 days a week? Well, Bill Putnam saved me on that too, because I actually had bleeding ulcers at one point because I was working so hard for such a long period of time that I started having health issues. And Bill Putnam said, Alan, I made some mistakes because Bill burned both ends and he was taking uppers to stay up, and he was, you'll never see a picture without a Jack Daniels sitting there or smoking a cigarette. Wow. And Bill had 3 triple bypasses. And he survived, and he says, Alan, it's not worth it. You have to step back and you have to, measure what life is about. And Bill was the guy who really, that's why he's such a mentor in my life. Mm-hmm. And Billy Putnam and I, we're, best friends and inseparable too. So
sweet guy.
So I just, and then when Bill died, it was hard to imagine because I could call Bill up, and even if I was doing a business deal, Bill was fantastic at say, here's a legal pad. He says, every important element of this deal has to be on this one page. If it's not, you don't want to get involved, right? If you can't simplify it down to this. And Bill was not only was a great businessman as well as a great acoustician, and he tuned his own pianos.
Wow.
It wasn't much. Yeah. He designed antennas for submarines. He had a separate company, and then he did all kinds of stuff.
Crazy.
He was like,
I had no idea.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Did you listen to that advice and apply it to your life, though?
Yeah, I did. I still work really hard, but not as hard. And I said to my sons and my kids, I said, guys, the harder Bill's classic line was, the harder you work, the luckier you get. Because it ain't going to fall in your lap.
True. You
got to make the effort. And if you make the effort, then, things will come your way. Mm-hmm. You'll have plenty of luck. Wow. And Joe works as hard as anybody I've ever seen.
He does.
He does. And I feel honored that Joe, worked at my studios and that he's still 100%, and we're all surprisingly lively.
Joe has not made the perfect record yet, he told me.
I'm still in search of... I think we all are, though. Don't you feel like, there's moments, like you say, where it fell together and for whatever reason, it sounds great. It sounds like what you had imagined in your head. But most of the time, it's not there, and you're striving day in, day out to get that. And also, part of it's almost a high in the sense that, those moments where musically it all comes together and you're in the control room and there's a sense of wonder. There's a sense of how did these 5 people in this room all connect and this just sounds magical, uninvited, or whatever classic album you've been a part of to We Are the World. There's things where on paper maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work, but
when it comes
pieces and you're in the control room and part of that, that's a religious experience.
It makes the whole thing worth living with those moments when they happen.
Yeah.
And of course, I do miss the organics of having all live players. I do miss that. And I'm fine with, machines. We can still make it work great, but there's nothing like having, Nathan is playing bass and, and we miss Jeff Beccaro so terribly because, God.
Incredible.
And even Keltner, we used to do all these great things with Jimmy, and it's all these, I miss that. I really do.
Nathan East?
Nathan East was, God, what can I say about Nate? Greatest bass player.
But great touch. I mean, I started as a bass player, and to just look at his hands, you're just like, forget it.
Well, that's like, I like, Chuck Berghofer. It's this unbelievable bass player.
And great tone to this day.
Oh, my God. Every note just pops. It's so clear. And he shows me, he mutes every string.
Yeah.
So that nothing except for the string he's hitting, and he's got these huge hands.
Yep.
And I just like, I just can't believe what his instrument sounds like.
Yeah.
What is a record, though, that you're most proud of or brought you to tears? I asked Joe that question. I said, what are a few recordings that made you cry in the control room?
I think really, to me, the Both Sides Now with Joni Mitchell was one of the favorite things I've ever done. And just I love her performances in that. On those, A Case of You, and that when I hear when I have vocals, I record. I can't even. It just moves me. Those moments. But I've done a lot of things I like. But that was, a high point for me, musically and sonically, and being with her. But it's one time we had the second record we were doing, which was it's a double album actually, and I set up a vocal setup at Larry's house, to do some of the vocals, right? And then he had a fire at the house, and it melted the 251. But all the master tapes were sitting on the floor, and and completely soaked. And I said, oh my God, I don't know what we're gonna do. But I said to him, I said, look, don't throw anything away. We did have copies, at Air Lyndhurst from the stuff, but I said, I can't stand a copy, I got to be the first master. So I took all these tapes, which were soaked. I took a 124 with no heads. I had a custom machine made to clean every tape. And I managed to save all the masters. And even it burned into the tape a little bit in the thing, which was the code track. So I actually was to jam sync new code track onto another open track so that I could lock up the 224 tracks. Wow. And we managed to save it, which is kind of crazy, but we did.
Amazing.
So, in fact, even the 251, the guys who make Telefunken microphones, I managed to get some of the parts to re-put that one back together again after the inside was somewhat melted. Yeah.
Incredible.
Anyway, but...
Did you learn about mics from buying all the used ones, or did you learn about mic technology then?
Well, it's like, obviously, when I was a kid listening to all these great recordings, I was intrigued with what mics are being used and what it sounded like. And then I would listen to, I said, God, if I could just have one of those U47s. And then there was a guy who made children's records who had a U47, and I ended up buying this U47 from him. And I put on my original STM Super X headphones, and I talk to this mic. Oh my God, this is crazy. This is so good. And then a friend of mine who was a rock and roll guitar player called me. He says, hey, Alan, they're having they're selling some stuff downtown, and they have these mics with power boxes, and they want $50 a piece for them. I said, oh, really? and it was this Up With People, had all these. And so I went down there. Once again, I didn't have that much money. I had like $200. And I bought I think about 8 C60s for $25 a piece. AKG 60s, right?
Yes.
And then, so I went quickly and sold those. Then I went back and I bought 5 Telefunken CM61s and some Synchrons and a bunch of mics. And that was my first kind of big buy. And so I had a bunch of these mics, and I was, still super young. And so I started recording. I started going out doing live recordings, what I would do live. And I also did a lot of symphonic recordings. I go and record. I even recorded, LA Philharmonic. I do all kinds of stuff. Royce Hall. And so I was recording. And then actually Bill Putnam and I, my first 16 track, I ended up buying from Jordy Hormel. And it was an MM1000. And it was sitting in a back room. Electronics were hanging in. It didn't work. So I got a great deal. So I got that machine. But I had that machine, and Bill Putnam says, listen, we're going to record the God, it was the Frankie Cap Nat Pierce band with Ernie Andrews, a live big band thing. So I took my portable MM1000, put it in the back of a truck, hauled it to this place, and then Bill built this custom console, which is 16 inputs, 16 mic pre's, went straight to the machine, and we recorded this big band record with Bill and I did together, with that MM1000 16 track.
Portable? What was that like?
Portable, my ass.
It must have been huge.
It is this
like
high,
It was like a videotape.
Video transport.
One more thing, in that machine, I didn't have input switching. Right, so anytime you punched in, you had to switch between input and tape. Otherwise, you get a delay. You know what I mean? And so, because I had 8 tracks above and 8 tracks below, sometimes if you only had 2 tracks left and you're recording it in stereo, I actually had to be like this to flip the input out switches. But the other thing was, then I couldn't push the record and play buttons. But they were huge buttons, and the record button and the play button were just between my nose and my chin. So I'm not joking. Already, I could actually punch in and switch the inputs simultaneously. I did eventually get input switching, and it made it a lot faster. But you had to do what you need to do. So
That's great.
Yeah, so I was kind of crazy, but
We put up a little post to ask the fans, the students, to contribute questions.
Sure.
And I'd love to run through some of those. And Sharon Corbett has a few that she wanted me to ask you as well, who we love.
Well,
how long did Sharon run your studio?
Quite a few years. Sharon was a fabulous. I adore her. She's just great. And she was our booking manager for Way Nashville, and
Decades, right?
What?
For a couple decades?
Oh, it was quite a long time. I can't know exactly how long it was, but I mean, she was there really almost from the beginning.
Yeah.
And I can't say enough how great she was.
Well, let's start off with one of her questions.
Yes.
It is, Alan, why did you design the Way Nashville Studio A control room the way you did?
Well, when I walked in the space, I really wanted a very big control room. I really wanted something because we also have full 3-channel setup, for LCR. And I said, a lot of times, and of course that certainly happened with like Cavallo and stuff, we ended up having everybody in the control room. And so we got a drummer out in the studio, but I got the 2 guitar players and the keyboard players, and everybody's in the control room. So I needed a space that, I needed everybody to hear the same sound. Because the big thing for me is the dispersion of the system, so that if I'm standing there, I can have 10 people behind me and they're hearing the exact same sound I'm hearing. Mm-hmm. And so I finally had the space to build a control room that had enough depth and I could get the low frequency response I wanted. And so I said, this is what this is perfect space for me. So I designed the control room and the ISOs and all that stuff, and so it's a pretty interesting thing. It looks more like a scoring control room that you'd go over at Warner Brothers or Sony or something.
Yeah, it's huge, comfortable, and amazing.
Somebody really wants to know if you could tell a quick story of the old Studio B Dalkin console.
Well, other than, I think I kind of went over what the issues are there with that console, but it was like, that was the thing where when I did sell that to Nigel, Beck got really mad at me, and so did John Bryant. And I said, look, guys, I love you guys, but I promised it to him, and I to be honest with you, I could have easily got $100,000 more for it, but I made a promise. Nigel, of course, done the Radiohead records in my studio, and he was a lovely guy, and he really wanted it. And I said, I made an obligation, and that's what it is. I have to let him have the console. He got it first. And so John got really pissed at me for a while, and so did Beck. But then I made a custom 4-channel mic pre that matched the console for him. It's a one-off, that I did for him as a favor.
Wow.
That he has that in his possession. Yeah.
That's awesome.
For Beck, yeah.
When did you first come up with the Ocean Way speaker design?
Well, essentially in my bedroom at my house. I was always interested I was buying up theater speakers out of theaters at my very early age, and I ran across these RCA theater speakers that I thought were really quite intriguing. And I didn't have a driver's license or anything, so a friend, this girl that I knew, I had a thing in my backyard called the Fort, and that's where I had my sound system and stuff. And she'd come over, we'd listen to records, and her father owned 50 Mart in Smart and Fall Iris, right? And so he had bought this old building in downtown LA, not downtown, it's kind of like, it was the Scorer Brothers movie building, and it had 2 theaters in it. And I said, well, and he was using it for the offices with 50 Mart. And I says, I bet there's some big speakers behind that screen that your dad doesn't need. And so I said, I'll give you a stereo system if I can have what's there behind the screen. And she thought that was a good deal. And he said, fine. So I went down with my buddies, and we rented a U-Haul trailer, and then I walked behind the screen. I go, oh my God, these are huge. How am I going to get these home? And so I managed to finally get him a trailer and get him in my house. And then I had him sitting in the driveway. And my dad comes up and says, "What the hell are these things sitting in my driveway?" But my mom was really great. And when my dad was away, we got like a little bit of a crane and raised them up and got in my bedroom window. And they're 7 feet high and 4 feet deep. So I had these theater speakers sitting in my bedroom.
Voice of the Theater?
Much bigger than that. These are more like A2s, but they're the RCA version, which is actually much better. So twin 15s and a straight horn, 7 feet high, and then a matching radio horn with twin drivers. So over a period of years, I figured out how to make this system sound pretty crazy. And then I ended up, because the mid-range drivers really sounded good, but really were only good to about 10K. So I ended up fooling around with super tweeters, and I actually found, like, if you know what an Altec 802D or an 808 driver is, it's the driver on a voice theater. Oh. And Altec made a diaphragm called the Symbiotic, which had a Mylar surround. And it didn't sound good from the front, but it sounded amazing from the back. So I says, if I took the back off and I put cotton in the hole as a direct rating tweeter, this thing sounded amazing. And it went out to 25 kilohertz. So I ended up having that 10K and above was triamped with Marantz 9s and mids and highs, which is what we had at Ocean Way. And then a friend of mine, Tektronix, built a custom transistor amp because I wanted transistors in the bass and tubes in the highs and mids. Mm-hmm. But then the other thing is, it was killer down to 40, but I wanted to go lower, right? But so I changed the surrounds of the woofers, and I got it to go down to about 38 hertz. But I still couldn't go as low as I wanted, so I built this cabinet with two D140Fs, and I put it face down on the floor between my two speakers, and I was on the second floor, so the entire floor of the room became a kind of a resonator, and I get flat to 20 hertz with this. And so it was a four-way system, triamplified. And then what I would do is, when I found the really great recordings, or like a Phil Ramone thing that I really loved, I for each LP, I had settings. So I had my electronic crossers and my sub-bass levels, plus I had these JBL graphic controller preamps, which had unbelievably great sounding bass and treble controls. And then I had the SE equalizers. So I came up with settings for every record. Because sometimes the recordings were either good recordings, but they just needed a little finessing.
Sure.
So so I actually I pull out a record here, and I had every setting of the crossovers, the sub-bass, the things for every LP. And so that was kind of what I did, and then
Amazing.
And that's why I started recording, because I just needed more fun stuff to play on my
So all the
speakers.
early Ocean Way systems were RCA horns?
They did have, yes.
And backwards tweeters?
Yes. It was from my original system when I was 15 years old.
Wow.
That's incredible.
So that was, so I kind of but creating and balancing speakers is no different than mixing. It's all getting the whole thing so it delivers the spectrum to you, in
I remember
one dose.
talking to Bob Ludwig once, and who's my
Bob's
all-time favorite mastering engineer. And Bob really explained to me how he listened in octaves. And to him, it was a matter of balancing every octave and getting it. So just like you were doing with your graphic equalizer, he was doing in his mind, in his ear, of just getting everything just even.
Well, what's funny with Bob was when I did this show in New York, it was an AES show, and I had some of my big speakers at the show, right? And I'd done that Bobby McFerrin record, Vocabularies, right? And I'm playing that, and Bob is listening to this, and he goes, "I think I've seen God. This is it, right?" And so I said, so I've got to have a copy of that master, which I then sent to him because he loved the music, and so that was fun. But he's got great ears. What can you say?
Incredible.
Yeah.
Next question. What are some of your favorite sounding recordings, benchmark audiophile recordings of your own or of others?
Well, the things, I did an album called 88 Basie Street with Count Basie that I did with Sammy Estico. That is kind of a hi-fi classic that I thought was a pretty fun sounding record. But as far as me finding stuff, obviously, there's a lot of great records. We still love Nightfly. What can I say? Elliott blew it away, on that record. And it's funny because that was on an 8078 and a 3M 32-track digital machine.
Right.
That's how it was done, right? And I eventually bought that studio too, from Donald, and I got that, and I sold that 8078 to, what's his name in Nashville? The guy, I can't think of his name right now. Blackbird.
Oh, John McBride.
I sold that original console to.
Oh, so that's what's in Studio A
Yes.
in Black.
I thought that was the Motown Westboard. And
No, I sold him that console, and that came out of Nigel.
he literally told me that was the Motown Westboard in Studio A there.
Yeah, I don't know. I sold him that 8078. And then he ended up some guy talked him into changing out all the discrete amps to some other amp. So he took out the Neve amps and put in something else.
Oh, yeah.
I won't go there.
Yeah.
One of those. Huh?
I'm not going. All right.
Okay.
Yeah, so, but I mean, there's so many great recordings, but obviously it was Phil Ramone stuff that really took me out. Even the Diane Warwick stuff they did live, the 2-track.
Yeah.
You know, and of course, right, the Quincy records, that Smackwater Jack, exactly what you're talking about, that sounded amazing. And then, you know, and Bruce Woodine stuff, like the James Ingram stuff, the Just Once and all that stuff. Because I was a big fan of James Ingram. And there's an interesting story here is that I was doing this thing, a song with Linda Ronstadt, you know, for the Spielberg picture, you know. And Linda was singing it originally with Ruben Blades, she did a duet, you know. And we did the thing, and it didn't quite work for Ruben, even though Ruben was great. But anyway, so my friend James Ingram, he was living in not too far away, and I said, James, get your ass down here. I think you're perfect for this, you know, somewhere out there. And so James comes in, he sings it in one pass with Linda, and it's perfect. And so that was, you know, just how that came down, and we,
Wow.
you know, that was like, you know, a magical moment, and yeah. Those things happen sometimes.
Did you do some Aaron Neville as well?
The Aaron Neville duet with Linda was done. George did that in Studio One. I was standing in there when they sang that song.
Okay, yeah.
Same song we did, I Will Always Live with Whitney Houston, and I was standing in the control room when that was done. 2 takes. Second take's the master.
Whoa.
And Schnee was engineering, I think, at that time on that one.
Huh.
He cut the original tracks, yeah.
Real quick, talking about Whitney Houston, you bought her studio in Atlanta and then sold it to Outkast.
Yes.
Which is one of the greatest hip hop groups ever. And
I love
Andre
Outkast.
3000 was just in Sunset Sound. It was incredible. But what was the process of that, real quick?
Well, Bobby, you know, her husband was really kind of running the studio, and he decided he wasn't going to pay the bills, really, you know, and so and Whitney stopped funding it, so I ended up kind of buying it from the bank.
Gotcha.
So I bought the real estate and all the gear for the bank, and also it was at a time when I was building Way Nashville, so there was a pretty amazing collection of gear in this place. And so a lot of that stuff I ended up moving, but I fixed up the place, got it clean, and I sold it to Outkast because it was a really nice studio.
What year was that, 90s?
I can't quite remember the exact
So
days.
that turned into Stankonia?
Whatever
the
their
Outkast
studio is now. It's you know, it was near Buckhead. It was a really nice location, and so I got that. I sold to them. Yeah.
Wow. And they still own that to
Yeah,
this
as far as
day?
I know, they still have it. It's a great location. Very
Yeah,
nice.
no,
studio.
I know the studio because I
Yeah.
worked at Tree or whatever the studio is right next door, and you could smell the Stankonia from Stankonia.
Well, yeah. But yeah, so
What studio? I'm from Chicago. What studios did you purchase or kind of?
I did buy a studio outside in Evanston, Illinois. I bought Pierce Arrow Studios in Evanston, Illinois, which had an 8078 as well.
Wow.
And that was interesting because they bought the old Pierce auto plant, and his father was wealthy, and it was like a big Westlake control room, and it had an 8078. But then they had a sprinkler thing go off, and the whole control room filled up with water.
The console too?
Yeah, and the console was on, and the water came up to about here, you know. And in fact, the ATRs were still on. Everything was on. It's amazing. And anyway, but then because the doors closed in such a way that the water stayed in, and so the water was this deep. But I ended up buying that whole studio, and it had all kinds of great stuff. But and I had this sort of soggy 8078. But we managed, and that ended up in Studio 3. That was the Studio 3 8078. We completely, luckily, it didn't get. It did damage. It had knee cam. Forgive me, but we managed to get the whole thing perfectly working and everything else, and that was the one that we had in Studio 3.
Yeah. Huh.
That was from Evanston, the college town?
Evanston, yeah, it was
Wow.
an interesting studio. Yeah, it was a nice place. So, but I remember I went to buy out the studio, and it was the middle of summer, and it was like really hot.
Sweltering.
Well, and it was a bankruptcy, and I remember I had made an offer on it. And I didn't know I was going to get it, so I had to go down there. And I went to I had offered, I think I offered $60,000 for the contents of the studio, right? Included the 9-foot pianos, everything. I had the whole thing. And some of the employees who basically were owed money were unsecured creditors, right? And they wanted to contest the sale. And so I took them out from the judge. And I said, listen, guys, I'll let you want certain stuff in there that belongs to you. I'll make sure you get everything. Just drop your arguments. And so I had $10,000 checks in increments if I had to go up in the bid, but I got it for $60K, the whole place. And I remember I had an Allied's van line delivered this place. And there was so much stuff in this place, I couldn't even fit it in the van line. So a friend of mine, Gordon Capes, who makes some stuff, said, call anybody you know, I'm having a fire sale. And I was selling stuff. I was rolling stuff up into the truck, and I was selling stuff. Before I'd left, I'd already recouped.
Incredible.
And that was one of those deals made in heaven. He's like, it was amazing. So
after all the success throughout these decades, do you have a regret of something you didn't get or something you didn't buy? Or something
you
you
can
lost out
always
on?
say that. So many deals, real estate and various things I could have bought. I mean, luckily I did buy all my real estate that were in my studios, and that turned out to be always a very good investment. Of course, we do like Prop 13.
Yeah, we do. As long as it stays in place.
Well, of course, they want to eliminate it for commercial property, but I'm not sure what the status that is right now.
Was there a studio, though, that you wanted at some point that you didn't get, or just something even in New York?
I wanted to buy, what is that building that's the Academy now has it as their archive. It used to be the ABC Vine Street Theater building. It's an incredible Art Deco building, and it had, how do they say it, radio theaters in it, 2 huge radio theaters with stages.
Oh, cool.
And I really wanted to buy it, and I was close to making a deal on that. We couldn't quite come to terms. That was what I would have liked. And the other thing was I wanted to buy A&M.
Yeah.
And I made an offer, and we were close to an agreement. And then Henson came in and offered a million more than I had offered and bought it.
Wow.
Yeah.
But I could have got it for, I think it was maybe 9.2, something to buy the whole place.
The whole lot?
I think they bought it for 11.4.
Yeah, that's a huge piece of property.
What's it worth now? 100?
Huge piece of property.
Well, it was a landmark, so there was limits to what you could do as far as using the property for things. But so I came close to getting that, but not quite.
And being a landmark, did they have to keep the studios?
Yeah, they wouldn't. I don't think they'd let you tear down stuff. So it kind of is, and so. But they were a good conservator of the place.
Yes,
and,
of course.
And so. I spent a lot of time at A&M in the early years working at those studios. I loved, even then the Hayco consoles were in there.
Yeah, I didn't work there then. I would go to Bernie's to have Bernie master records.
Right.
But when Jimmy stepped in, I worked there an awful lot with Jimmy.
Yeah.
Great rooms.
They're great rooms. To be honest, I much prefer the Jimmy Iovine redo. I like the original rooms the way they were when we did We Are the World was the old A&M room.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And those are great sounding rooms.
Yeah.
And I don't think it was an improvement. I liked the way it was. I really did. I'm sorry.
Can you tell one little quick story about the We Are the World session at all?
Well, my involvement really was just to record the choir, and of course Quincy was my correspondent. So I went down there, and Berto was there, I was there, John Guest was there, and Quincy, and then there was like 5 of us in the control room when we did all that stuff, and it was it really went amazingly smoothly, and that was because Quincy was extremely well organized, and everything was very well thought out, and I would say Michael was kind of high as a kite at the time we were doing that. I don't know what he had been dealing with. And Quincy was trying to keep Michael under control and calm, and he was like kind of crazy, at the moment. I've seen him in different states, but Quincy was the guy who pulled it off.
Wow. Yeah.
And kind of like, actually, because Ricky Minor sort of took the place, was very close to Quincy. And Ricky has that same ability.
Yes.
He can just make things, when everything's going crazy, Ricky comes in and it's just smooth as hell.
Yeah.
And I built a studio for Ricky Minor behind Ocean Way when we were doing all the American Idol stuff. So I did a bunch of the singles and stuff for American Idol with Ricky. And Ricky's one of my closest friends. And we had a fabulous studio behind Ocean Way for quite some time. I'm going to be with Ricky this weekend, actually. Ricky and Rachel are coming over, getting together this weekend. But he's another guy I have infinite respect for. Yeah. Not he's an astonishing musician, but as a producer, he's
great musician.
So talented.
Absolutely. Great band leader, great MD.
Well, when we were on the board of governors, the Grammys together, right? And Ricky cuts to the chase quicker than anybody I've ever seen. He has he's amazing. Just an amazing guy. And he has so much of Quincy's finesse.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's all I can say.
Question, final questions, but for the young engineer listening to this, or for Farouk, who's an assistant engineer over here, what's the most important thing in 2023 to elevate and advance your career in engineering, do you feel?
Well, Joe, why don't you say something? And then I'll revisit that, okay?
I think it's about having positive attitude and being supportive of the artist. And I think when an artist walks in the room and they see an assistant that is kind of glowing and willing to help out and is a fan of the music, I think that goes a long way for them. I think you're in this because you love this business, and if you show that, I think it gets you a lot further than all the technical skills or recording skills that you could ever amass. I think your passion and commitment and love of it gets you a long way.
Paul, as a studio owner, and Alan, I'll come right back to you, but Paul, as a studio owner, what do you look for in a hire at Sunset Sound or Sound Factory in the 80s? What's an important characteristic of someone's vibe or their talent? What do you find?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think enthusiasm and people that are really dedicated and that are not people that are here complaining, that's always a downer. You hire somebody and they're immediately complaining about the hours or who they had to work with. No, it's somebody that's embracing that this is where they want to be, this is what they want to do in life. And those kind of people, I think, are the people that have always survived and moved on here and become very successful.
The Mike Persantis.
Mike Persanti's one of them. Peggy McCreary's another one. Chad Blake. I mean, there's on and on. These are people that were dedicated in their field and what they wanted to do.
And Mike really loves it. He really is into it. It's like we just did that run for T-Bone over at the Village and put the speakers in. And Mike's just the greatest guy. I mean, he's just,
I heard those speakers.
Yeah, we went over and listened to the new Bob Dylan album on them.
Yeah, they're kind of fun, It's, but I mean, it's you got some great people. But for me, working in these studios, the seconds that I have had work for me in your studio it's just a pleasure. I mean, they're so into it, and we're having so much fun. We're all having fun together. And when it sounds ridiculous, they appreciate it just as much as I do.
Yes, exactly.
When we were doing drums in here with Bobby Columbia, for like Blood, Sweat, and Tears kind of tracks, right? And I think it sounded kind of fun. And it's like, I think they appreciate what that is. And this room sounds great. So the microphones, no complaints.
Yep.
It sounded just fabulous. But I think you have an amazing staff. And also your technical staff is great too. I mean, everybody here is, in my view.
Everybody says that about the staff at Sunset Sound, that the assistants are so quick on Pro Tools. Even Joe Bonamassa just told me that the other day.
Well, I say you hit the mark, and I'm just thrilled it's here. That's all I can say, is that I have the opportunity to come here and record and have that level of expertise.
Do you still have a giant collection of vintage tubes and parts and some still in the boxes?
I kept about 100 mics, for myself, because I do a lot of scoring. I do orchestra stuff, so I still have a pretty big collection of mics that I kept. And I do have a pretty good collection of aux gear, Malangs and all those things I like, because I'm didn't plan on walking away from it. I still really love doing it, so.
Will you work your whole life, do you think?
Oh, I think so. I'm lucky. My hearing is really good, and I'm, the same thing, Joey, like, one thing I do is, when I play it loud, it's for very short periods of time. Actually, when I'm mixing at a very modest level.
Mixing, I'm always quiet, yeah.
I take the time to bounce out, but I need to know that it's big and punchy and has all the stuff. It's like, I did the system, for Steve Aoki. And Steve's a pretty great producer, and he makes really good sounding stuff. And for him, the most important thing is that nothing is harsh. So when they turn it up in the club, it's always fun and fat.
Right.
And so I have a big set of speakers for him and a smaller set. He needs to know that when he walks out of his room and he goes in to do a show, everything is where it needs to be. And he's a wild man too. Chris is really fun. He's a fun guy. Steve
Aoki. Was that in Vegas? You did that for him?
I think he makes, 50 million a year as a DJ. I think he does pretty
insane.
good.
Wow. It's insane.
He's
what those guys
rather
do.
successful guy,
Has he thrown a cake in your face yet?
Not yet, but I've heard. Yes, right.
Do you like Vegas?
Yeah, we enjoy Vegas. We have a lot of friends. A lot of my Santa Barbara friends have residences there for obvious reasons. And so, my manufacturing is still in LA. Actually, it's in our manufacturing plant's in Burbank. And then we have warehouses in Riverside. we have our wood manufacturing in Riverside, and then our warehouses are in Glendale. So we're actually not in LA City.
So what is Ocean Way manufacturing now? Is there a line of monitors, or
we make
just the customs?
We have a broad line of monitoring systems of every natural variety, and then we do a lot of Atmos sound systems. We just did, Chris Lord Alge's full Atmos system for his.
Oh, fantastic!
Thing. And he has my big speakers and all the Atmos systems. So we do a lot of that. And then we did a theater up in Santa Barbara, which is the Riviera. It's home of the film festival. It's their home base, a 1920s theater. It has 48 surround channels, and each screen channel, I think you'll appreciate this, if you measure the on-X response behind the micro screen at, say, 2 meters, basically each screen channel from 19 kilohertz to 20 hertz is within 1 dB. Never been done. But my Dolby guy said, I didn't know that was possible, really. And so it's a super high fidelity Atmos
That's
system.
amazing, yeah.
And they have a thing called Cinema Society on weekends where producers and directors come up to screen their films, and they'll do a Q&A. So I've had all these major directors up there. And then Dolby, it was such a high-profile venue that they provided Dolby Vision projection because it's a real high-profile venue.
Yeah.
But our biggest thing now is live sound. We have a new kind of amazing sound system that's a revolution. Because, of course, I mean, you as a mixer, a lot of times, I'm sure you've done that. If I finish an album and it's an important album, sometimes I will mix the first live show at the Bowl, or I'll go to the Greek Theater, because that's really important to me. The press, it's got to sound great. And so the issue I always had was that I can get it sounding pretty good on axis, but the second 40% of it here's mono. And if you're at a show and say you're 30 rows back and you're center, you can kind of hear stereo. But if you move 10 rows to the right, you can no longer hear less speaker. It's gone.
Yeah.
So we make a speaker that'll do a flawless 100 degrees. You could be anywhere in the room and it's perfect stereo. You could be sitting against the right wall, 4 feet in the front, and it sounds like you're standing in front of the speakers. So it's a real revolution.
And it's conventional loudspeaker technology?
It fits in the same space as an array system, but it's a whole different approach.
Huh.
And it's super high
Wow, I'll
fidelity.
have to hear this.
Well, I'll have to, guys, we're going to have some more shows coming up. But we did the Granada Theater in Santa Barbara has a full 3-channel system we did. And they do everything from Brian Setzer to Broadway shows to the LA Philharmonic. And it's been very successful. So that's what I'm working on right now. And it's been, and American Music and Sound, which does about $1.5 billion in sales, they have taken on our brand as their exclusive live sound system.
Great.
And so we're, they agreed to buy a significant number of pairs and such. So we're
Fantastic.
we're having fun.
Do any of your children partake in the business of?
Well, my son died. He was very involved, and my daughter is more like a marine biologist, underwater photographer, so she doesn't do that kind of stuff.
Right.
But unfortunately, I lost my son not that long ago. So he's,
Sorry.
So at the moment, it's just me. And my grandkids, of course.
Paul, do you have a final question for Mr. Sides?
So yeah, I guess I do. So you're not in the studio business at all anymore?
Nope.
It's all over.
It's all. I'm really a manufacturer, other than recording, and I loved it. I couldn't have had more fun. It couldn't have been a better time. And but as things changed, and the music business changed, it was just on fire for all the period of time. And the studios were fine. And then, like when I sold the 6,000 building to Cello, which was he was a billionaire, and it was like he offered me one of those prices that it's hard not to take. But I had my 60/50 building, and I had Record One. I didn't really need that, and that was the beginning of me making a change. But really, the manufacturing really began to take a big part of my life and was very successful. And so I just started shifting gears a little bit, and then it was hard to walk away from 60/50 because it was my home for all these years, and I love the place. But the same thing, we own the real estate, but we also own the front door to Sunset Gower. We own the street. And they wanted that piece of real estate really, really bad. And so it was another opportunity, at the point. And then when Dr. Dre wanted Record One, that was a perfect opportunity. And so I just basically slowly slipped out of that business. But the other thing too, it was, it really was just an insanity of, at its peak, I just can't imagine having more fun or doing anything like that. And so my thrill is that you guys are here and this beautiful studio exists. And Jeff at Village, I do a lot of work at Village too, and I love Jeff and I love the studios, and I'm glad these places are still exist because it's.
That kind of segments into. I wanted to ask you something else. So, are you a little sad to hear that United has shut its doors?
Well, I did the last sessions there. We did a huge big band record I was doing there.
Really?
Oh yeah, no, we were, we used. And they basically, when we mixed we tracked in B, we mixed in A, and when I walked out the door, so did everybody else. It was the end of it as we know it.
Was that coincidental? It's just that you happened to be there?
It just happened I had a book before this thing came up.
That's wild.
And so, it's
That's a loss of a great facility. Yeah.
You know, I doubt. You know, who knows? I'd be surprised if it ever passed. I think it's over.
I'd heard though there were a couple of producers that were taking it over, and that it was gonna be
filming.
Just
filming.
At the moment, it was all filming. You know, they said if someone wants, they don't want to do any. You know, they don't want to have any staff, but if they're willing to pay enough money that they consider it worthwhile, I would imagine they would consider, doing something. And we'll see where that goes.
I got in a little argument with somebody once because they take a lot of credit for your work in those two studios down there. I mean, none of those people were even around when.
Well, it's kind of funny, it's like you think in terms of the classic, United Western period. It was a great period, particularly, in the '60s. I mean, they were on fire up until the '60s. But as time progressed, things changed. I mean, they were started doing a lot of TV shows and things, and really, you think that Western recorders, there wasn't even a lounge. There was like a vending machine in the hallway. It was a different time, and the sensibilities that changed the rock musicians, they wanted a lot more than that, even though the rooms were amazing. And it was pretty utilitarian. And so, the opportunity rose. And Bill said to me, and it says, when I first took over B, and then I took over A, and then I took over 2, and then I took over 3, and then I took over 1, and then eventually I ended up, with the whole place. And Bill was thrilled because I was picking up where he left off. And it was really what Bill was doing in the peak of the '60s is sort of where that kind of stopped, and then I picked up back and we brought it back 100%.
Yeah.
And so Bill was my big supporter, and he was thrilled because of all the work he put into this place, and we brought it back 100%. And it became, at one point, I think it wasn't unusual to have half the top 10 of Billboard. We were on a pretty big roll, and albums recorded in the studios were sold in excess of 1 billion copies. So it was a pretty good run. But also, the period of time that I had it for, 30 plus years, 30 years. I mean, if you look, even it started United, I think, started around 59.
Wow.
I think
what was first? United Western or Western?
United was first.
United was first.
Right. And I think it was, I think he started building in 58, and I think he opened in 59. And then Western, I think, was more like 62. He took over the Western building and built that into the other studios. But, so that was from say from 1962 up to 1970, probably 3 or 4, it was, it was the United Western Studios. But then I ran it for, 30 years, 35 years, whatever it was.
Yeah.
And then I sold it to United, and they were there for about, I guess, 7 years. So yes, and the same is true about the 6,000 building. I ran it. So I'd say the majority of its success did happen in as far as that was the period.
Yeah.
But Bill had an amazing time in those studios. But of course, you didn't sell as many records back then.
Right.
But having the Beach Boys on your list and the Mamas, the Papas was a pretty good list of folks, And a lot of great records on there. And of course, the Solace Sinatra stuff. Yeah.
Don't you find, though, that influences even artists today that come in here that are 19 years old? Like, they get to record in Studio One where the Doors worked and the Beach Boys worked, and the vibe and the nostalgia, even the story of Paul and his father. It's just a father-son operation, the studio. Sunset Sound. I think that's why I'm here.
Well, even Light My Fire still sounds pretty damn good. I mean, Bruce Botnick, I said, hey, he did Brazil 66.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah,
I mean,
Sergio Mendes, Brazil 66. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Those were great sounding records.
Great sounding record.
Really great sounding records.
Oh, yeah. Well, when I met Bruce for the first time and he came in, we were doing Caddyshack, I'm All Right. We did the music for that thing. And it was Andy Johns was recording it, and it sounded amazing. I remember that was when, and that's where I met Bruce. Then Bruce just stayed on. We did all the Kenny Loggins records, and Bruce became one of my long-term clients, and we did lots of stuff together. And it was a good time was had. And so I see Bruce and Marie, pretty regularly still. They're doing great in Ojai, and.
Yeah, that's who Don Landy told me. He's like, why haven't you had Bruce Botnick on yet? What are you guys doing? That's what Don Landy said. He's like, you got to get Bruce. You got to get Bruce.
Well, Bruce, to some degree, too. I introduced Bruce to Jerry Goldsmith, too, because we were at Fox and we were doing Star Trek 1 with Jerry Goldsmith. And Bruce had digital magnetics. And I said, well, why don't we bring in the very first digital recording and we do a simultaneous live 2-track on digital. And so we set the whole thing up. And we got some of the first cues recorded. And the union came in and said, well, we're not going to allow you to record digitally unless you pay us twice.
What?
So
Really?
so we had to remove all the digital gear. Otherwise, they weren't going to play. Anyway, but later on, when it came to editing this, Jerry Goldsmith got together with Bruce, and they had some of the stuff direct to 2-track, which they saved. Then Bruce just edited the rest of it, and that became a long-term relationship between Jerry Goldsmith and Bruce. And that lasted through Air Force One and all those pictures that Jerry Goldsmith did, that Bruce did. So it was a good time. But actually, I remember we were doing E.T. over at Sony Stage, and then I brought all the mics, all the M50s and all that stuff, and set it all up, on the stage to do that E.T. And I remember that first cue that John did. It was like, he always starts with a big cue, John does. And I'm watching the screen. I'd never seen the picture before. And I'm hearing this music, and Steven's practically crying because the music is just so unbelievable. Wow. I just, I feel, growing up in L.A., I couldn't ask. Well, another friend of mine, a guy named John Krause, he was an engineer at Capitol, and he was the night recording manager. And he recorded, there's a recording that John Williams did that I was very fond of. It's a jazz record. It's Shelley Mann's unusual cast of My Fair Lady with Jack Sheldon and Irene Crowell. And it's a big band, but it's 4 trumpets, 4 bones, 4 French horns, tuba, and symphonic percussion. And it's recorded live to 2-track in Capitol, probably 1966, and the recording is unbelievable. So I would go out and hang out with John Krause at night, and he'd pull masters out of the file, and we would just listen to shit at night, And because the whole tape library was right there. Just walk back there and grab it.
Yeah.
Here's Nat King Cole it is. And I mean, some of those recordings are just unbelievable.
Yeah, it's incredible what those guys did.
And John made me one-to-ones of some of these recordings. So that when I met John Williams through Lionel Newman stuff, I said to John, I just such a fan of this recording. And it was never released on CD or anything else, and he had no copies of it. So I had a direct master right off the original master. So then I made John one for John, so he'd have one. And then, and John was such a big fan of John, what can I say? And Jerry both. John and Jerry were just so much fun to be with and to watch at that period of time.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Well, I can't tell you how much this means to us for you to come in and sit down. To say we're a fan of yours is an understatement.
Well, thank you.
And it's just special. I'm so glad we started this because it's like this stuff gets to be documented and help the future engineers, do you think it's more competitive now to be a recording engineer?
In a way, perhaps, because there's so many students, the technology's available to people, but it was so hard to learn when we started. There was no schools, there was no software to buy. You listened to albums, and you became a nuisance to whoever your mentor was or whoever you could get to mentor you. So that was the toughest thing. I mean, I think now you can get a head start on your own.
Yeah.
You can, these guys that come in here for assisting gigs or runner gigs can come in with a good knowledge of things, and that's pretty great. Where you had to, I bought a TAC 4-track. That's how I learned to record,
Yeah. That was a good little machine, actually. That little TAC 4-track's a pretty nice little machine. 3340 with that's
exactly.
That's surprisingly good sounding tape machine.
Do you remember the day that Hank Santacola took you down to Santa Monica to his place?
I do. It's a little vague, but I do remember going
and he
down
said, "This
there.
is Alan." And this is his place.
What street? Was it off Santa Monica?
It's on Montana.
Yeah, it's right on Montana.
Yeah. It was a post office substation.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
But it's great that you
now-
did. And then, I say, Hank and I had a lot of fun. Hank was actually a really good engineer, too. He actually was very talented. He really was. He had a great sense of sonics and stuff. And so, we had much fun. And then we made a lot of deals together. So Hank ended up with a pretty nice mic collection.
Mm-hmm.
For O. Henry, most of those
nice
mics came
studio
from
there.
me. Yeah, so.
And that was a good console, too, that he had custom built there, too.
Custom API.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a nice API.
Great sounding.
Yeah,
I remember he had an 8078 sitting in his house that I think he sold to you. I remember him showing me this 8078. I think it was the first one I ever saw.
Oh, really? Yeah.
And he goes, "Yeah, Alan's bugging me to buy it. I'm probably going to sell it to him."
It is. It's very possible I did buy it from Hank. I can't remember.
Yeah.
What was interesting, is that there were the 8078s. Of course, I love 8078s. But the Air Montserrat consoles They look like 8078s, but they're all IC. They're all 5534s.
Yeah.
And so when
they do sound good.
They sound pretty good.
They do sound good, but they are different.
They're not the same.
Yeah.
Well, the difference is that the open loop high frequency gain of the original screen amp is much better than the 5534. So the high frequency section of the equalizer in the original one sounds considerably better. Also, the mic pre, the high gain circuitry, is better on the discrete amps than it was on the ICs. But I remember, the console A&M I've used, quite a bit, and it sounds fine. But actually, there's another story here. Kind of, my friend George Massenberg was doing an Earth, Wind and Fire record at Montserrat, and they recorded on that console. And then when they got back, everybody thought it was a bit drab sounding. And I remember he and Maurice, were having some issues, because they had a fantastic thing together.
Oh,
but this stuff was not really sounding. And he had the GML consoles there, and the GML EQs. It was hard to get. It wasn't like API 550As.
No,
where you can get
different pieces.
Instant gratification,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And I remember, so Alan says, we're having a little conflict. Can you come in and mediate the mix? So I went in, and I love George, of course, and I love Maurice, and I did an motion sound with Maurice, and I did different things. And I brought some API 550As with me. And I remember I put them across the overheads, plus 412K shelf. Oh, there's the highs. Okay, put on the snare, and then I think I did like a whack track with some 165s, for the kicks and snares to make them punchier and some stuff. And all of a sudden, it was really kicking ass. Sounded great. And then I got them on a good path, and they mixed the record, and everything was fine. And so, it's because George is ridiculously great.
George is
so good.
Incredible.
I didn't even know where to start.
Incredible, yeah.
Right. But, he would only use his stuff, so he was limiting himself a little bit because, the stuff he did at Hollywood Sound, I still am so blown away with the Earth, Wind and Fire records that George did, and the Little Feat stuff, and just lots of great stuff. And
they scream out of the radio when you hear them now.
Yeah, it's just incredibly punchy and just,
horn sounds.
It's all
crazy.
just great.
Yeah.
What can I say? So
did David Foster produce the Chris Bodie record you did a few months ago in here?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and David was a good. Obviously, we did. I remind David that I think we did Unforgettable with Natalie, which he also was producing, and then we did the Barbra Streisand Broadway record where she sang. That was also in Studio A. So I said David has done a number of rather successful records in my studio. So.
He did After the Love Is Gone here with Earth, Wind and Fire at Sunset Sound.
I can't get better than that. Yeah. Why? Because I met Foster through David Page, actually. That's what, because, of course, you recorded Rosanna in here, right? Mm-hmm. The Al Schmidt recorded.
Rosanna, Africa.
And then they mixed it at Record One with Lidani.
That's right.
Well,
that's
Lidani,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Greg Lidani.
Oh, yeah.
And
we just had Lukather on a couple months ago.
Who is the most entertaining guitar player in the
Yeah,
world.
absolutely.
There's nobody with a better sense of humor than
he's a
Luke.
funny guy.
Best.
Quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what a player. Oh, my God,
You just saw him live last Friday. You went and saw him at the Greek with Ringo and the All-Star Band.
All-Star Band.
Did you record Danger Zone, Kenny Loggins?
I don't remember if we did that or not. I don't remember, actually.
Do you know Jim Messina started as a tech here at Sunset Sound in 1960?
Get out of here.
A tech, and then became an engineer.
I know him pretty well. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
What can you say?
Yeah, him and Paul are really good friends. He's been on this show too. Messina.
Oh, he's a lovely guy.
Yeah.
I mean, lives up in Santa Barbara, so.
He moved to Nashville.
Who was Nashville?
Yeah, he's in Nashville.
And Paul Wolf. They both moved down there.
Yeah.
Do you have a Paul Wolf story to tell us? Because he was giving us shit about the lighting on his interview.
Oh, Paul.
Tell it Drew to get his lighting.
He's another guy that I have a lot of fun with, over the years. Remember, he made a limiter that was a motorized fader. So it basically controlled the motorized fader and that's how it limited. It compressed. And that's pretty amazing. I guess all you do is go through a fader and it controls the fader. And I don't know what happened to that, but it worked.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty fast.
I was just about to say, was there some kind of delay in it?
No, it's fast as hell. Well, of course, actually George's was much faster than flying faders, because the problem with flying faders was it's a very good system, but if you're doing a live mix, but once you make the move, then it's fine.
Yeah.
But GML was instantaneous because I did a lot of direct to distant live to 2-track stuff where I really needed whole group sections, and if I did it on fly faders,
very
it was like
slow,
a wave.
Very slow. Yeah.
But on GML, it was just like instantaneous. But and then George, we had all those GML systems, and then George got mad at me because his new update that he had for the software had some bugs in it. And I said, well, George, I can't really, it's not working quite well. And he got mad at me because Bruce Marion managed to keep all those working perfectly. with the original software. And because George and I worked, we worked with Sony on the development of the, on the 48-track Sonys, but also, the Sony mic, the C800G.
Oh, did you really?
Yeah, we work with them on all the various prototypes and all that stuff, which I love that mic. I think it's a really great mic.
Yeah, it's a really extraordinary
microphone.
Very different sounding microphone.
Yeah, and so George and I, we went to Japan together, and we did a lot of stuff and worked with Sony on the filter rates on the. They kept saying that you can't hear this with the sharper filter and the softer filter, and so we set up a test at a studio at Sony Studios where I had KM54s and percussionists live. We went through the machine, where A being different filter slopes, to prove to them that it's a huge difference. And then George and I ended up starting a company called AG Digital, Alan George, and we had a whole bunch of Sony 48 tracks, because at the Complex, he had the Complex and I had Ocean Way, and if you own the 48 tracks, they always try to negotiate the deal with you. So we didn't own any 48 tracks. We said, well, we've got this great company, AG Digital. They'll rent you the 48s. They didn't know it was our company. So George and I that was another kind of profitable venture that I did with George. That was good.
Gosh,
That's great.
It's so funny. I'm texting Alan for the last couple of months, and he's like, "Oh, I'm in South Korea." I'm like, "Okay, well, give me a call back when you're in States." "Oh, I'm in St. Barths now. Oh, I'm in Vegas." Like, do you get tired?
Nah.
I love it.
Well, Joe, you're pretty sparky too.
man,
you're producing,
I'm always traveling. I just got back from Canada, going to Nashville. That's just part of the gig.
Oh my God!
Do you have to find the right woman to understand this lifestyle of recording and engineering and record producing?
Well, there's that one thing, I used to say to my seconds: never tell your girlfriend you're going to be home at a certain time.
She'll never make it.
One time, my wife and I, we were fans of Wolfgang Puck and the old spot called Hollywood, right? And so we had a reservation to go there, and we were all excited about it, and she was all dressed to go, and I was working on, I don't know what it was, some Neil Diamond, something, and I know I'm going to be done at 4, then 5, then 6, 6:30. Don't worry, darling, it's fine. 7:30 and 8:30, and finally, okay, I get to her house at like 9:30. Pick her up, I take her to Spago, and they closed at 10.
Oh, jeez.
So we ended up penny feathers. She did not talk to me for a significant period of time. So I said to all my seconds says, never promise, because invariably,
yes,
they're going to you just can't do that.
1 hour means 4 hours. Yeah.
The best plans. And so I say I'm going to mix, and I'm going to be home. No, you're not. You're not. You're not going to mix that. It's going to take, so she knows.
Wow.
Yeah.
Incredible. Thank you so much
Thank
again.
you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, this was fun.
Thank you,
Great
Alan.
to talk to you.
Oh, a pleasure.
Yay. Thank you.
Thank you,
This
sir.
was great. It was
That
fun.
was great.
All right. Well, hey, guys.
Wealth of knowledge from you guys.
Yeah, good stories.
Well, I'm glad.